Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, a place where curiosity slows its pace, where questions are allowed to linger, and where learning doesn't need to hurry anywhere in particular. This is a space for drifting thoughts, gentle explanations, and ideas that don't demand answers right away. If your day has been long, or your mind feels crowded, you're in the right place. You don't need to focus too hard. You don't need to remember everything. Just let the words move at their own speed and take you with them. Tonight, we're turning our attention to a place that sits quietly on maps, yet somehow never stays quiet in the imagination. A stretch of ocean that looks ordinary at first glance, marked by neat lines and familiar coastlines, yet carries a reputation that refuses to fade. It has been blamed, questioned, defended, exaggerated, dismissed, and resurrected more times than most places on Earth. Ships have crossed it without incident. Planes pass overhead every day. Satellites watch it from above with calm indifference. And still, the stories keep returning. Tonight, we're exploring what still goes wrong inside the Bermuda Triangle. It's a curious thing, how a location can feel unsettled even when it hasn't moved an inch. The water there doesn't glow. The waves don't rise higher than elsewhere. There's no sign posted on the horizon warning travellers that they're entering a zone of uncertainty. And yet, for decades now, people have spoken about this region as if it behaves differently, as if something about it resists full explanation. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to leave questions behind. Some places earn their mystery through isolation, others through danger. This one earns it through familiarity. It sits along some of the most travelled routes in the world. Commercial shipping lanes pass through it. Vacation flights cross it daily. Weather satellites and ocean buoys monitor it constantly, and yet, despite all of that attention, it continues to feel slightly unfinished as a story. Not because everything that happens there is strange, but because not everything that happens there settles comfortably into simple explanations. Before we drift any further into it, let me ask you something gently, the way we often do here. Where are you listening from right now? Not just geographically, but situationally. Are you lying down, sitting quietly, moving through a dim room while the rest of the world winds down? And what time is it for you in this moment? The answer doesn't need to be spoken, just noticed. It's fitting, really, to think about time and place while talking about somewhere so often associated with both going missing and being found again. If you find this space calming, or if you enjoy letting complex ideas unfold slowly without being pushed toward a conclusion, consider giving this video a like or subscribing to the channel. It helps this quiet corner reach others who might also be looking for something thoughtful to listen to while the day lets go. No urgency, no pressure, just a small gesture if it feels right. Now, let's begin easing into the story itself, not by jumping straight into disappearances or dramatic claims, but by taking a moment to understand what we're actually talking about when we say the Bermuda Triangle. Because even that name, so commonly used, hides a surprising amount of uncertainty. The Bermuda Triangle isn't a formally recognised region. It doesn't appear on official nautical charts as a special zone. There are no universally agreed upon borders. Ask 5 sources where it begins and ends, and you'll likely get 5 slightly different answers. Most descriptions loosely connect 3 points: Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Draw lines between them, and you get a rough triangle, floating over a wide expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. But those lines exist only in the imagination. The ocean itself doesn't acknowledge them. That vagueness is part of what allows the mystery to breathe. When something goes wrong anywhere in that general area, it's easy to pull it into the triangle's orbit to say it happened there, even if the coordinates are fuzzy or the conditions were already known to be difficult. Over time, this has allowed unrelated incidents, decades apart, to blend together into a single narrative. Not a lie exactly, but not a clean record either. And yet, even when you strip away exaggeration, something remains. Not a supernatural force or a hidden intelligence, but a set of overlapping factors that make this region unusually complicated. Busy traffic, unpredictable weather, strong ocean currents, deep water close to shore, shifting magnetic readings, human error layered on top of all of it. None of these are unique on their own. What's unusual is how often they coincide. There's also the matter of expectation. When people enter a place already believing it is dangerous or strange, they pay closer attention to every irregularity. A flickering instrument, a delayed radio message, a sudden squall that might have gone unnoticed elsewhere suddenly feels significant. The mind fills in gaps. Patterns emerge where randomness might otherwise suffice. This doesn't mean the experiences aren't real. It means they are filtered through anticipation. Still, anticipation alone doesn't explain why certain stories endure while others fade. There are ship logs that end abruptly, radio transmissions that sound confused or disoriented, aircraft that deviated from expected paths before vanishing. These details are often retold with dramatic emphasis, but even when approached cautiously, they raise questions. Not questions of other dimensions or vanishing portals, but of navigation, communication, and how easily things can unravel when multiple small problems line up at once. One of the quiet themes running beneath all of this is overconfidence. The triangle sits near technologically advanced regions. Crews passing through it have often believed they were well equipped, well trained, and well supported. This sense of security can sometimes make early warning signs easier to dismiss. A compass that doesn't quite behave as expected. A weather system that forms faster than forecasted. A current that pulls more strongly than anticipated. Individually, these are manageable. Together, they can overwhelm. And then there's time, not in the dramatic sense of lost hours or warped reality, but in the practical sense of how quickly conditions can change. The weather in this part of the Atlantic doesn't always announce itself politely. Storms can build rapidly, especially during certain seasons. Visibility can drop without much warning. Wind and waves can turn coordinated navigation into a series of rush decisions. When that happens, records become incomplete, and later reconstructions rely on fragments. What makes this particularly frustrating for investigators is that the ocean is very good at erasing evidence. Deep water swallows debris, currents scatter what remains, wreckage doesn't always float, and even when it doesn't always surface where expected. This leaves room for speculation, because the absence of clear answers is often mistaken for the presence of something hidden. Over the years, advances in technology have solved some of the triangle's puzzles. Wrecks once thought lost forever have been found. Flight paths have been reconstructed with greater accuracy. Weather models have improved. Many incidents once attributed to mysterious forces now have reasonable explanations, but not all of them. And that's the part that keeps the triangle from settling fully into the past. There are cases where timelines don't quite align, reports that contradict each other without an obvious reason, situations where experienced crews made decisions that seem uncharacteristically poor, equipment failures that don't fit expected patterns. These aren't proof of anything extraordinary, but they are reminders that even with modern tools, uncertainty hasn't disappeared. It's also worth noting that the triangle's reputation didn't emerge organically from sailors swapping stories over centuries. It gained momentum in the mid-20th century, shaped heavily by media, books, and repeated retellings. Certain incidents were emphasized, others were ignored. Patterns were drawn after the fact. This doesn't mean the stories were invented, but it does mean they were curated, whether intentionally or not. Still, reputation alone doesn't account for why people continue to report a sense of unease when passing through the area, even today. Pilots and sailors often describe it not as fear, but as a subtle tension, a feeling that demands attention, a reminder to double-check, to stay alert, to trust instruments but verify them. It's the kind of awareness that emerges when experience meets unpredictability. As we move forward, we'll take our time with this place. We'll look at how its story began, how early sailors interpreted what they encountered, and how modern science has tried to separate coincidence from cause. We'll examine the role of navigation tools, weather systems, ocean currents, and human psychology. We'll also sit with the parts that still don't fit neatly, not to sensationalize them, but to understand why they resist easy closure. Nothing here will require belief in anything beyond what can be observed and reasoned through. At the same time, nothing will rush to dismiss lived experience simply because it's inconvenient. The goal isn't to solve the Bermuda Triangle once and for all, but to understand why, even now, it continues to feel slightly unfinished. So as you settle into the rhythm of this exploration, let your attention soften. You don't need to track every detail. You don't need to form conclusions yet. Just follow the thread as it unwinds, moving from old stories into modern explanations, and from certainty into the quiet spaces where questions still linger. We're only just entering the waters now, and there's plenty of room to drift. At first glance, the Bermuda Triangle looks like a simple idea. 3 points, 3 lines, a neat shape floating on the Atlantic like a warning sign drawn with a ruler. Florida to Bermuda, Bermuda to Puerto Rico back to Florida. A triangle you could sketch in a few seconds on the back of a napkin while waiting for a drink. It feels contained, defined, manageable. And that sense of clarity is part of the problem, because the Bermuda Triangle has never actually stayed in one place. Unlike a country or a reef or a shipping lane marked by buoys, this region doesn't exist as a fixed entity. There is no official boundary agreed upon by maritime organisations, no coordinates locked into international charts, no point at which a ship crosses an invisible line and enters a different category of ocean. The triangle shifts depending on who is telling the story, when they are telling it, and what they are trying to explain. Some descriptions pull the northern edge closer to the Carolinas. Others stretch the southern point deeper into the Caribbean. A few versions barely include Bermuda at all. Over time, the shape expands, contracts, tilts, and blurs. Incidents that occur hundreds of miles apart are sometimes grouped together under the same name, as if proximity alone is enough to link them. The triangle becomes elastic, able to stretch just far enough to include whatever story needs a home. This flexibility has allowed the idea to survive criticism. When one explanation is challenged, the boundaries quietly adjust. When a disappearance is proven to have occurred elsewhere, the definition slides slightly to keep it inside the narrative. The triangle isn't pinned down because pinning it down would limit it, and limits are uncomfortable for a story that feeds on uncertainty. But even when stripped of exaggeration, even when narrowed to its most conservative interpretation, the region still covers a vast and complex area of ocean. This isn't an empty patch of water, it is one of the busiest corridors on the planet. Major ports sit along its edges. Cruise ships, cargo vessels, fishing boats, private yachts, military craft and commercial airliners all pass through it regularly. It is watched constantly, crossed constantly, relied upon constantly. And that alone creates conditions where things are more likely to go wrong, not because the ocean is malicious, but because traffic multiplies risk. When many routes intersect, small errors compound. A slight navigational misjudgment that might go unnoticed in open water becomes more serious when shipping lanes are dense. A weather system that might be avoided elsewhere becomes unavoidable when schedules are tight. Decisions are made faster, margins shrink, and when something does fail, the consequences arrive sooner. The triangle also sits at the meeting point of different environmental systems. Warm waters from the Caribbean push northward. Cooler currents slide down from higher latitudes. Air masses collide above it. Trade winds interact with seasonal storms. This creates a region where conditions can change quickly and unevenly. Calm seas can give way to heavy swells without much warning. Clear skies can close in. Visibility can drop. Wind direction can shift just enough to complicate navigation. This instability isn't mysterious in itself. Meteorologists understand it well. Sailors plan for it. Pilots receive forecasts and updates. But understanding doesn't eliminate difficulty. It simply names it. And naming something doesn't always make it easier to manage when you're inside it. One of the most persistent ideas associated with the triangle is that it behaves differently than surrounding waters, as if it follows its own rules. In reality, what often happens is that multiple ordinary factors overlap more frequently here than in many other places. Strong currents intersect with heavy traffic. Rapid weather changes intersect with long distances between safe harbours. Deep water sits surprisingly close to shore, leaving little margin for recovery if something goes wrong. Depth plays a quiet but important role. Much of this region drops off quickly, descending into thousands of meters of water not far from land. When vessels sink here, they don't settle gently onto shallow seabeds. They fall into darkness. Recovery becomes difficult, evidence disappears, and without physical remnants, stories fill the space where data should be. The ocean floor doesn't preserve events the way land does. There are no twisted guardrails or scorched pavement. There are no footprints to follow back. The sea absorbs impact and moves on. Currents scatter debris. Salt corrodes metal. Time erases traces. What remains are last transmissions, incomplete logs, and the knowledge that something ended without witnesses. This absence feeds imagination. It encourages explanations that step beyond navigation and weather, because those explanations at least offer structure. It feels more satisfying to believe something intentional happened than to accept that chance, environment, and human limits aligned at the wrong moment. The name itself adds to the instability. Bermuda Triangle suggests precision, geometry, clean edges, but the reality is more like a cloud than a shape. It's an idea imposed on a fluid environment, and fluid environments resist neat outlines. Water moves, air moves, magnetic fields fluctuate. Even the Earth itself isn't perfectly stable. The planet wobbles, its magnetic poles drift. Measurements change over time. Magnetism is often mentioned here, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. The Earth's magnetic field does behave differently in various regions, and this area is sometimes noted for having relatively complex magnetic characteristics. Compasses don't always behave exactly as expected. Variation between magnetic north and true north shifts over time and location. This isn't unique to the triangle, but in a place where navigation depends heavily on accuracy, even small discrepancies matter. When older vessels relied more heavily on compasses and less on satellite guidance, these variations could contribute to confusion. A navigator who didn't fully account for local magnetic variation might slowly drift off course without realizing it. Over long distances, small errors grow, add poor visibility or rising weather, and that drift becomes dangerous. Modern technology has reduced this risk, but it hasn't eliminated it. Systems can fail. GPS signals can be disrupted or misinterpreted. Over-reliance on automation can dull situational awareness. When people trust tools completely, they may miss subtle signs that something isn't aligning the way it should. The triangle's reputation also owes much to storytelling habits. Humans are pattern-seeking. We look for clusters. When multiple incidents occur in roughly the same region, we connect them, even if they happen decades apart under different circumstances. We draw lines between unrelated dots because lines feel meaningful. They give events a shared identity. This is especially true when events are unresolved. An unsolved disappearance invites association. Another unresolved case nearby feels like confirmation rather than coincidence. Over time, the region itself becomes the explanation, rather than the specific conditions of each incident. Media coverage amplified this effect. In the 20th century, certain stories were repeated again and again. Details were sharpened, ambiguities were smoothed into drama. Ordinary causes were downplayed in favour of questions that couldn't be answered quickly. This wasn't always malicious. Mystery sells attention, and attention keeps stories alive. But beneath the layers of retelling, there remains a place that genuinely challenges those who move through it, not because it is cursed or alive, but because it demands respect. The triangle sits at the intersection of commerce, weather, geography, and human ambition. It's a reminder that even well-travelled routes carry risk, and that familiarity can breed complacency. Another reason the triangle refuses to settle is that it exists as much in the mind as on the map. Pilots and sailors often learn about it early in their training, sometimes informally, sometimes through cultural exposure rather than manuals. This knowledge shapes perception. When something unusual happens in this region, it feels more significant than it might elsewhere. Attention sharpens, memory anchors itself more firmly, psychology matters here, stress alters perception, fatigue narrows focus, expectation influences interpretation. A flicker on a radar screen can feel ominous if you believe you're in a place known for problems. The same flicker elsewhere might be dismissed as interference. This doesn't mean the experience isn't real, it means the frame around it changes. There's also the matter of scale. The ocean is vast. Even busy regions contain enormous empty spaces. Search and rescue operations here cover huge areas. Time matters. Delays matter. When something goes missing, the window for finding clear evidence is narrow. By the time help arrives, conditions may have changed completely. Tracks vanish, signals fade, and what might have been a straightforward recovery becomes an open-ended question. This feeds back into the triangle's instability as an idea. Each unanswered case reinforces the sense that the region itself is responsible, even when the truth is more mundane and harder to accept. Mechanical failure, human error, weather underestimated, routes miscalculated. These explanations feel incomplete when bodies or wreckage aren't found. They lack emotional closure. And so the triangle drifts, not physically but conceptually. It expands to include new stories and contracts to defend itself against scrutiny. It exists somewhere between fact and folklore, grounded enough to be taken seriously, vague enough to avoid being fully dismantled. What's important to notice is that this instability doesn't mean nothing is happening there. It means many things are happening, overlapping, interacting, sometimes colliding. It means this region magnifies the consequences of small mistakes. It means the ocean behaves like the ocean always has, but under conditions that increase pressure on those passing through. As technology improves, some mysteries fade. Routes become safer. Forecasts become more accurate. Monitoring becomes constant. But the triangle doesn't disappear, because its foundation isn't just in events, it's in uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't vanish simply because tools improve. It shifts, it becomes subtler, it hides in edge cases and rare alignments. This is why, even today, the triangle resists being pinned down, not because it defies science, but because it sits at the edge of what science can fully account for in real time. It's a place where models meet reality, and reality doesn't always cooperate. As we continue moving forward, the focus won't be on proving or debunking the triangle as a single phenomenon. Instead, it will rest on understanding how such a reputation forms, how it persists, and why certain environments seem to collect stories the way others collect shells. The triangle may not stay still on a map, but the forces that shape its story are very real, very human, and very much still at work. Long before the Bermuda Triangle had a name, long before lines were drawn between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, sailors were already moving through these waters with a quiet sense that this part of the Atlantic demanded respect. Not fear exactly, and not superstition in the dramatic sense, but a kind of alertness that settled into the body when familiar landmarks disappeared and the ocean began to feel less predictable. These early sailors didn't talk about anomalies or unexplained forces. They talked about signs, behaviours of the sea, and moments when the world seemed slightly out of step with expectations. To understand where the first uneasy stories came from, it helps to remember what sailing meant centuries ago. Navigation was slow, imprecise, and deeply dependent on experience. A ship's position was estimated, not known. Latitude could be approximated by the stars, but longitude remained elusive until much later. Clocks drifted, compasses varied. Maps were incomplete and sometimes wildly inaccurate. When something went wrong, there was rarely a clean explanation waiting at the end of the journey. The Atlantic itself was not yet a well-mapped highway. It was a vast, shifting surface with moods that changed over days or even hours. Winds didn't always follow expected patterns. Currents carried ships farther than crews anticipated. Storms appeared with little warning. In this environment, uncertainty was normal, but certain regions earned reputations for being more demanding than others. Sailors passing through the area we now associate with the Bermuda Triangle often noted strange combinations of conditions: calm seas paired with confusing winds, skies that looked stable while swells rose unexpectedly, compasses that seemed sluggish or slightly off, not wildly broken, but enough to raise doubts. These weren't dramatic failures, they were subtle inconsistencies that forced constant adjustment. One of the earliest written references often cited comes from the voyage logs of Christopher Columbus during his first transatlantic journey. While crossing the Atlantic near this region, he noted that his compass readings did not align with the North Star as expected. This was not described as something supernatural. It was described as concerning. Columbus was an experienced navigator for his time, and deviations mattered. His crew, already anxious in unfamiliar waters, grew uneasy. What Columbus encountered was likely a natural magnetic variation, something we now understand as the difference between magnetic north and true north. At the time, this concept was not well defined. To sailors who relied on compasses as their primary guide, any inconsistency felt personal, as if the sea itself was withholding cooperation. These early observations didn't turn into legends overnight. They circulated slowly, passed from crew to crew, port to port. Sailors talked. They compared notes. Certain routes gained reputations for being tricky, not cursed. Difficult. Demanding. Places where attention could not slip for long. Stories from this era often focused on disorientation rather than disappearance. Ships arriving later than expected. Crews reporting that their estimates were off by days. Journeys that felt longer than they should have been. These experiences were explained through weather, currents, or divine will depending on the storyteller. But the shared thread was a sense that time and distance behaved differently here. It's important to remember that early sailors did not have the luxury of separating natural explanation from belief. Religion, science, and observation blended together. A storm was both a physical event and a moral test. A navigational error could be a miscalculation or a sign of divine displeasure. The ocean was not just water. It was a living force in the worldview of those who crossed it. That worldview shaped how stories were told. When something unexpected happened, it was framed in familiar terms. A sudden storm might be described as the sea turning against the ship. A confusing current might be spoken of as the water pulling with intent. Language personified the environment because it helped make sense of danger. As European exploration expanded, traffic through the Atlantic increased. More ships meant more incidents, and more incidents meant more stories. Some ships vanished entirely, lost to storms, reefs, or navigational mistakes. Others returned damaged, crews shaken, accounts inconsistent. Each story added another layer to the region's emerging reputation. The Caribbean and surrounding Atlantic waters were especially challenging because of their geography. Islands rose suddenly from deep water. Reefs waited just below the surface. Warm waters fed storms that could intensify rapidly. Seasonal weather patterns were not yet fully understood. Hurricanes in particular were unpredictable killers, often striking without the warning signs sailors expected from European waters. Survivors of such storms carried stories home. They spoke of winds that changed direction too quickly, waves that didn't behave normally, and skies that darkened faster than seemed reasonable. Again, none of this was outside the realm of nature, but without modern meteorology, it felt chaotic. Another factor shaping early unease was isolation. Crossing the Atlantic meant weeks or months without land. Supplies were limited. Illness spread easily. Fatigue was constant. In such conditions, perception changes. Small problems feel larger. Time stretches. Memory becomes unreliable. A minor navigational error might be remembered as a prolonged period of confusion. Sailors also relied heavily on dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed, direction, and time. Currents could quietly sabotage this method. The Gulf Stream, which flows through part of the region, is powerful and fast. A ship caught in it could be carried far off course without the crew realizing it, until landmarks failed to appear where expected. To sailors unfamiliar with this current, the experience could be deeply unsettling. They would sail as planned, only to discover that their estimates were wrong. The ocean had moved them without announcing itself. This invisible force reinforced the idea that the sea here had its own agenda. Cultural differences also played a role in shaping early stories. Indigenous peoples of the Caribbean had their own understandings of the sea, built on generations of observation. European sailors often misunderstood or dismissed this knowledge, yet still absorbed fragments of it through interaction. Warnings about certain waters or seasons were sometimes interpreted as superstition rather than practical advice. As trade routes developed, the region became busier. Ships carrying goods, people, and sometimes enslaved individuals crossed repeatedly. With increased traffic came increased loss. Ships sank. Crews died. Cargo disappeared. Insurance claims were filed. Explanations were required. When no clear cause could be established, rumour filled the gap. What's notable is that early stories rarely focused on sudden inexplicable vanishings in the way later legends would. Instead, they emphasised difficulty, the sense that voyages through this area required more effort, more vigilance, more humility. Success depended not only on skill but on conditions aligning favourably. Over time, certain phrases and descriptions became common. Sailors spoke of seas that looked calm but felt heavy beneath the hull, winds that shifted without warning, nights where stars seemed harder to read. These descriptions were poetic, but they were rooted in experience. They reflected genuine challenges faced repeatedly by different crews. Written records from the era are uneven. Many logs were lost. Others were incomplete or intentionally vague. Captains sometimes downplayed problems to protect reputations or financial interests. In other cases, exaggeration crept in, consciously or not, as stories were retold. Memory is not a precise instrument, especially when filtered through stress and survival. A storm that lasted hours might be remembered as days. A navigational error might feel longer because of fear. These distortions accumulated as stories travelled. By the time later generations began compiling accounts, patterns seemed to emerge. Ships delayed, crews confused, equipment unreliable. It was tempting to see these as evidence of something inherent to the region, rather than a combination of factors common to long-sea voyages in a demanding environment. The lack of definitive explanations reinforced this temptation. When a ship vanished without witnesses, imagination filled the silence. The ocean does not offer closure easily. Wreckage sinks. Evidence disperses. Families wait without answers. Stories harden into legends because legends provide shape where reality does not. It's also worth noting that early sailors did not experience these waters in isolation from broader anxieties. The Atlantic represented the unknown itself. Crossing it was an act of courage, desperation, or ambition. Every successful crossing felt like a victory over chaos. Every loss felt like a reminder of human vulnerability. In that context, it made sense to attribute difficulties to the place rather than to chance or error. Blaming the sea preserved confidence in skill. It allowed sailors to believe that mastery was possible elsewhere, even if this region resisted it. As centuries passed, navigational tools improved, maps became more accurate, understanding of currents and weather expanded. Yet the stories persisted, carried forward by tradition. What had begun as practical caution slowly took on an air of mystery. When later writers revisited these early accounts, they often emphasized the most unsettling elements, while ignoring the mundane explanations. A confused compass became a symbol rather than a measurement problem. A delayed voyage became evidence of lost time rather than shifting winds. Still, beneath the layers of embellishment, the core remains. Early sailors experienced this region as demanding. They recorded confusion, difficulty, and moments of unease, not because something supernatural was at work, but because the environment challenged the limits of their tools and understanding. These first uneasy stories matter because they set the tone for everything that followed. They framed the region as one that required caution. They seeded the idea that the ocean here did not behave entirely as expected, and once that idea took hold, it became easier for later generations to attach new meanings to it. As navigation evolved and exploration gave way to commerce, the old stories didn't disappear. They adapted, they waited, and when technology advanced enough to promise control over the sea, the moments when that promise failed felt sharper, more surprising. The unease that early sailors felt was not irrational. It was a response to uncertainty, to real challenges, to an environment that did not forgive complacency. That same unease, reshaped and reinterpreted, still echoes today whenever something goes wrong in these waters, and as we move forward from these earliest accounts, the focus will shift. The sea will become busier, the stories more specific, the records more detailed, but the underlying tension between human confidence and natural unpredictability remains steady, quietly guiding the narrative onward. For as long as humans have ventured away from familiar coastlines, they have depended on simple questions to stay alive. Where am I going? Where have I been? And which direction will bring me safely forward? Before satellites, before radio beacons, before glowing screens and digital coordinates, one small instrument quietly carried the weight of those questions. The compass did not promise precision, but it offered consistency. North was north, or at least it was supposed to be. When sailors spoke of compasses losing their confidence, they were not describing dramatic failures. The needle did not spin wildly. It did not point south out of spite. What unsettled them was something subtler, a hesitation, a sluggish response, a direction that seemed almost right but not quite, enough to introduce doubt, enough to make a navigator pause and wonder whether the problem lay with the instrument, the ship, or the sea itself. In the waters associated with the Bermuda Triangle, this doubt became part of the experience early on. Sailors noticed that compasses sometimes behaved differently here, not consistently wrong, just inconsistent enough to demand constant correction. For crews already navigating by estimation and celestial observation, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a quiet erosion of trust. To understand why this mattered so deeply, it helps to understand how fragile early navigation really was. Sailors could determine latitude reasonably well by measuring the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. Longitude, however, remained a persistent problem until accurate marine chronometers became available much later. Without precise longitude, east-west positioning relied heavily on dead reckoning and compass bearings. In that context, even a small error mattered. A single degree off course might not seem significant over an hour. Over days or weeks, it could place a ship dangerously far from its intended path. Add strong currents and shifting winds, and the margin for error shrank further. The Earth's magnetic field is not uniform. It varies across the globe, both in strength and direction. The angle between magnetic north and true north is known as magnetic declination, and it changes depending on location. Today, this information is mapped, updated, and integrated into navigation systems. Centuries ago, it was poorly understood and rarely standardized. Sailors relied on experience to compensate. They learned that in certain regions, compasses needed adjustment. They memorized local quirks. But the Atlantic presented a particular challenge because its magnetic behaviour changes gradually over space, not abruptly. There is no clear moment where a sailor could say, "Now the rules are different." The needle simply begins to drift, almost imperceptibly, until the accumulated effect becomes noticeable. The region we associate with the Bermuda Triangle sits near areas where magnetic variation has historically been more complex. This does not mean the magnetic field is unstable or dangerous. It means it is nuanced. For modern instruments, nuance is manageable. For early compasses, it was confusing. Compasses themselves were not perfectly reliable instruments. They were affected by temperature, vibration, nearby metal, and the construction of the ship. Iron fittings, cargo, even cannons could influence readings. As ships evolved and carried more metal, compasses required careful placement and regular calibration. Not all crews understood this fully. When a compass behaved unexpectedly, sailors faced a difficult decision: trust the instrument and assume their senses were misleading, or trust their experience and assume the instrument was compromised. Either choice carried risk. Doubt slowed decisions. Hesitation invited error. What made this especially unsettling in the Atlantic was the lack of immediate feedback. On land, a wrong turn is quickly obvious. At sea, a mistake may not reveal itself for days. By the time a discrepancy becomes clear, reversing course may be impossible due to weather or supply constraints. Logs from various voyages describe moments where compasses disagreed with celestial observations. Sailors noted that the needle seemed to shift slightly without explanation. These observations were often written plainly without drama. The drama entered later, when these records were reread through the lens of mystery. At the time, sailors lacked a framework to explain magnetic variation scientifically. They knew magnets pointed north, but not why. The idea that the Earth itself generated a magnetic field was not yet fully developed. Variations felt arbitrary. An arbitrary behaviour in a survival tool felt threatening. This sense of threat was magnified by the environment. The open ocean offers few reference points. When clouds obscure the sky, stars disappear. When landmarks vanish over the horizon, the compass becomes the primary guide. Any uncertainty in its reading feels amplified by isolation. As stories circulated, certain regions gained reputations. Sailors warned each other informally. They advised caution. They recommended double-checking bearings, cross-referencing with the sun when possible, and trusting instincts alongside instruments. This advice was practical, but it also reinforced the idea that something about the place demanded extra care. Over time, these practical warnings blended with storytelling. A slightly off bearing became a compass that could not be trusted. A confusing correction became a loss of direction. Each retelling smoothed nuance into narrative. Later generations sometimes interpreted these accounts as evidence of magnetic anomalies unique to the Bermuda Triangle. In reality, magnetic variation exists everywhere. The difference lies in how well it is understood and accounted for. The Atlantic's variations were simply encountered before the science caught up. Even today, magnetic north is not fixed. It drifts over time, moving tens of kilometers per year. Maps must be updated. Systems recalibrated. Pilots and sailors are trained to account for this. The phenomenon is not mysterious, but it remains dynamic. Modern navigation systems compensate automatically. GPS relies on satellites, not magnetism, for positioning. Yet compasses are still carried as backups, and magnetic variation is still taught. The old lessons have not vanished. They have been absorbed into procedure. There are also moments even now when magnetic readings behave unexpectedly. Solar activity can disturb the Earth's magnetic field temporarily. Geomagnetic storms can affect navigation systems, radio communication, and power grids. These events are usually predicted and monitored, but they remind us that the magnetic environment is not static. For early sailors, such disturbances would have arrived without explanation. A compass that seemed reliable one day might behave differently the next. Without knowledge of solar activity or geomagnetic interaction, the change would feel personal, localized, almost intentional. This is how uncertainty becomes narrative, not through sudden catastrophe, but through repeated small moments of doubt. Each time a sailor questioned the needle, the idea that this place interfered with navigation grew stronger. Another layer of complexity comes from human expectation. When sailors believed a region was tricky, they paid closer attention to instruments. They noticed small deviations they might ignore elsewhere. Attention sharpened perception, but it also increased anxiety. An anxious navigator is more likely to second-guess. Second-guessing leads to course changes. Course changes increase complexity. Complexity increases the chance of error. What begins as caution can spiral into confusion. This feedback loop is subtle and difficult to document, but it matters. Navigation is as much cognitive as mechanical. Instruments provide data, but humans interpret it. Confidence plays a role. When confidence erodes, decision-making slows. In modern retellings, compasses in the Bermuda Triangle are sometimes portrayed as actively malfunctioning. This exaggeration obscures the more interesting truth. The compasses were not broken. They were revealing the limits of understanding at the time. The ocean did not confuse the needle. The Earth's magnetic field behaved as it always has. What changed was the sailor's expectation that north was a single, unchanging direction. When this expectation failed, it forced a reckoning. Either the instrument was wrong, or the world was more complex than assumed. Without the tools to embrace complexity, sailors leaned toward explanation through story. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a natural human response to uncertainty. We tell stories to stabilize experience. We assign character to forces we do not yet understand. We say the sea pulls, the wind tricks, the compass lies. These phrases capture emotion more than mechanics. As time passed and science advanced, magnetic variation was mapped and measured. The mystery faded, but the stories remained. They were retold without the original context, stripped of their practical origins and reshaped into something more dramatic. Yet even stripped of exaggeration, the lesson holds. Navigation depends on trust, and trust depends on understanding. When understanding lags behind experience, unease fills the gap. The Bermuda Triangle did not cause compasses to lose confidence. It revealed how fragile confidence can be when knowledge is incomplete. It exposed the space between instrument and interpretation, between data and decision. This space still exists, even now. Technology reduces it, but never erases it completely. Systems fail, signals degrade, human judgment remains part of the loop, and whenever judgment meets uncertainty, the old tension returns. As we continue forward, this tension will appear again in different forms. In radio transmissions that cut out at the wrong moment, in weather systems that intensify faster than predicted, in decisions made under pressure with limited information. The compass was only the first tool to highlight this pattern. It showed early sailors that direction is not always absolute, and that trust must be earned repeatedly, not assumed. The stories that grew from those moments did not come from nowhere. They grew from hands gripping wooden decks, eyes scanning empty horizons, and needles that wavered just enough to make certainty feel like a luxury. And once certainty is questioned, everything else begins to feel a little less solid, setting the stage for the next layer of unease to emerge. There is something uniquely unsettling about a ship that leaves port and never arrives. No distress call that clearly explains what went wrong, no debris field neatly confirming an accident, no final message that ties events together into a comprehensible ending. Just absence. And in the long history of maritime travel, absence has always been the hardest thing to sit with. When people speak of vanishing ships in the region associated with the Bermuda Triangle, they often imagine dramatic moments. A vessel swallowed whole, a sudden catastrophe, a clean break between existence and nothing. But the reality, as it so often is, tends to be quieter and more confusing. Ships did not usually vanish in an instant. They faded out of contact. They missed scheduled arrivals. They became late, then worryingly late, then officially missing. Time plays a central role in these stories, not only because ships fail to appear, but because the accounting of time itself often became uncertain. Logs stopped abruptly, reports conflicted, estimates of position no longer aligned. Crews that were later found alive sometimes described journeys that felt longer or shorter than they should have been, even when distance suggested otherwise. To understand why this happened, it helps to imagine life aboard a ship before modern communication. Once a vessel left port, it entered a kind of informational isolation. No updates, no corrections, no outside confirmation of position or progress. Everything depended on onboard instruments, observation and judgment. When those elements drifted out of sync, time itself became slippery. A ship delayed by weather might lose days without realizing it. Strong headwinds slowed progress. Currents pushed against intended routes. Crews recalculated based on assumptions that no longer held. The calendar date remained correct, but expectations did not. When arrival times slipped, concern grew. This concern intensified in busy regions like the Atlantic routes near the Caribbean and North America. Ships were expected to arrive on predictable schedules. When they did not, alarms were raised. Insurance companies took notice. Ports waited. Families worried. And with each unanswered delay, imagination filled the silence. Some ships were eventually found. Others were not. Those that were found often told partial stories. A damaged hull, missing lifeboats. Cargo shifted. Logs that ended mid-sentence or mid-calculation. These fragments offered clues but rarely full explanations. One recurring theme in these accounts is disorientation. Crews reported confusion about position, weather that seemed inconsistent with forecasts, seas that behaved unpredictably. None of this required exotic explanations. It required only the convergence of fatigue, pressure, and limited information. Fatigue is often underestimated in these narratives. Long voyages strained bodies and minds. Sleep was irregular, watches rotated, stress accumulated, decision-making suffered. A tired navigator is more likely to misread instruments. A tired crew is slower to respond to sudden changes. When fatigue meets environmental complexity, small errors multiply. A course correction made slightly too late. A storm underestimated by a few hours. A misjudged current. Each mistake alone is manageable. Together they create cascading failure. This cascading nature is important. Vanishings were rarely caused by a single dramatic event. They were the result of sequences. One problem led to another which limited options, which forced decisions under pressure. By the time disaster struck, the ship was already vulnerable. The ocean does not announce these sequences. It does not mark turning points. From the outside, a ship appears to vanish suddenly, because the gradual unravelling happened far from observers. What looks like disappearance is often the final stage of a long unseen struggle. Then there are the missing hours. Stories where crews later claim that time seemed distorted. Journeys that felt compressed or stretched. Accounts where logs and recollections didn't align. These reports have fueled speculation for decades, but they also align closely with what is known about human perception under stress. When routine breaks down, the brain's sense of time changes. Anxiety can make minutes feel longer. Monotony can make hours blur. Sleep deprivation disrupts memory formation. Under such conditions, people misjudge duration without realizing it. At sea, where external time cues are limited, this effect intensifies. Days blend together. Watches rotate. Sun and stars are sometimes obscured. Without reliable reference points, internal clocks drift. When crews later attempted to reconstruct events, gaps appeared. Not because time literally vanished, but because memory failed to record it cleanly. Those gaps, when compared to official schedules or expectations, appeared as missing hours. In some cases, the confusion was compounded by navigational error. A ship might believe it was farther along its route than it actually was. When land failed to appear on schedule, panic followed. Decisions made in panic are rarely optimal. Radio communication, when it became available, added another layer. Early radio signals were unreliable. Static, interference, and limited range created misunderstandings. Messages were cut short or misheard. A garbled transmission could suggest confusion even if the situation was manageable. When communication stopped entirely, assumptions filled the void. Silence was interpreted as disaster, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. The region's weather contributed significantly to these patterns. Storm systems could form and intensify quickly. Visibility dropped. Waves interfered with equipment. Ships struggled to maintain course. In such conditions, keeping accurate logs became difficult. If a storm destroyed navigation tools or flooded compartments, records might be lost entirely. When wreckage was never recovered, the absence of documentation encouraged speculation. Another factor often overlooked is the sheer number of ships passing through the area over centuries. High traffic increases the absolute number of incidents, even if the relative risk is not higher than elsewhere. More ships means more failures, simply by probability. But probability feels unsatisfying when faced with loss. People want reasons, patterns, explanations that go beyond statistics. This desire shapes how stories are told and remembered. Insurance records show that many supposed vanishings were later resolved. Ships thought lost reappeared weeks later in distant ports, damaged but afloat. Others were misreported or confused with different vessels of similar name. These corrections rarely received the same attention as the initial mystery. Yet even with corrections accounted for, not all cases were resolved. Some ships genuinely disappeared. No survivors, no confirmed wreckage, just last known positions and unanswered questions. In deep water regions, wreckage may lie thousands of meters below the surface, beyond reach for most of history. Even today, searching such depths is expensive and limited. Absence of evidence persists not because nothing happened, but because recovery is difficult. Time adds another layer of distortion. As years pass, details fade. Records are lost. Witnesses die. What remains are summaries, often simplified. Nuance erodes. Stories harden into familiar shapes. A delayed arrival becomes a disappearance. A damaged ship becomes a ghost ship. A misjudged journey becomes missing time. Each retelling smooths complexity into something easier to repeat. This process is not unique to the Bermuda Triangle. It happens wherever danger, uncertainty, and loss intersect. Mountains, deserts, polar regions all carry similar narratives. What sets this region apart is its accessibility and visibility. It is close enough to be familiar, yet unpredictable enough to remain unsettling. There are also cases of ships found abandoned, crews missing, cargo intact. These accounts are especially unsettling because they suggest sudden evacuation. But here again, mundane explanations exist. Fire, flooding, structural failure, toxic fumes. Crews may abandon ship believing rescue imminent, only to be lost at sea. Lifeboats do not guarantee survival. In heavy seas, they capsize, they drift, they disappear. The ship, larger and more buoyant, may remain afloat long enough to be found later. When such a vessel is discovered, the absence of crew invites speculation, but the decision to abandon ship, while tragic, is often rational under perceived threat. Missing hours appear again here. Survivors of maritime disasters often struggle to reconstruct timelines. Trauma disrupts memory. Stress compresses perception. What feels like minutes may have been hours. What feels like hours may have passed quickly. When investigators compare survivor accounts to instrument readings or logs, discrepancies emerge. These discrepancies are sometimes framed as mysterious, but they align closely with known psychological effects. Still, knowing this does not make the stories feel less eerie. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the idea that time can slip unnoticed, that journeys can unravel without dramatic warning. As technology improved, some of these problems diminished. GPS provided precise positioning. Satellite communication reduced isolation. Weather forecasting improved. And yet, even with these advances, incidents still occur. Ships still sink. Crews still make mistakes. Weather still overwhelms preparation. The ocean remains indifferent to human plans. What changes is not the risk itself, but how well it is understood. Modern investigations can reconstruct events with greater accuracy. Data provides clarity. But data does not erase loss. The stories of vanishing ships endure because they sit at the intersection of knowledge and uncertainty. They remind us that even with preparation, not everything can be controlled. That time, once lost, cannot always be recovered or explained. As we move deeper into this exploration, attention will shift upward, from the sea to the air above it. Aircraft face their own versions of disappearance and disorientation, shaped by different tools but similar vulnerabilities. The same themes return: trust, perception, environment, and the thin margin between routine passage and sudden confusion. The ships were the first to reveal these patterns, moving slowly enough for problems to accumulate quietly. Their stories linger, not because they prove anything extraordinary, but because they expose how fragile certainty can be when surrounded by vast moving water and the relentless passage of time that does not pause to explain itself. Long before satellites tracked every movement from above, before radar painted neat pictures of weather systems and air traffic controllers watched blinking symbols slide across glowing screens, the sky over the Atlantic was experienced much the same way the ocean had been for centuries before it: vast, empty, unforgiving of mistakes. Pilots who flew over open water understood this instinctively. Once land fell away behind them, the margin for error narrowed, and every sensation inside the aircraft took on added significance. When people talk about the air above the Bermuda Triangle feeling slightly wrong, they are rarely describing a single dramatic event. There is no consistent report of engines suddenly cutting out in unison, or instruments spinning wildly without cause. What emerges instead from decades of pilot accounts is something quieter and more unsettling, a sense that conditions change faster here, that the sky is less predictable, that small irregularities stack up in ways that demand constant attention. Flying over water is fundamentally different from flying over land. There are fewer visual references. The horizon can blur into haze. Clouds reflect light off the ocean surface in ways that distort depth perception. At night, the absence of ground lights removes one of the brain's key orientation anchors. Pilots rely more heavily on instruments, and when instruments become the primary reality, any inconsistency feels amplified. The region associated with the Bermuda Triangle sits beneath a convergence of atmospheric systems. Warm, moist air from the tropics rises and meets cooler air moving down from the north. This interaction fuels rapid cloud formation and sudden weather changes. Storms can build vertically faster than expected. Clear air can become turbulent with little warning. Updrafts and downdrafts form unpredictably. None of this violates known meteorology. In fact, it is well documented. But documentation does not eliminate difficulty. Pilots plan based on forecasts, and forecasts are estimates, not guarantees. When conditions evolve faster than predicted, crews must adapt in real time. One of the most commonly reported issues in this region is unexpected turbulence, not the dramatic, violent shaking often imagined, but irregular air movement that disrupts smooth flight. These disturbances constrain both aircraft and crew. Instruments vibrate. autopilot systems disengage, workload increases. For pilots already managing long over-water legs, fatigue plays a role. Even in modern aircraft, extended flights demand sustained concentration. When turbulence appears suddenly, it raises stress levels. Stress narrows attention. Narrowed attention increases the likelihood of missed cues. There is also the issue of weather visibility. Tropical weather systems can look deceptively manageable from a distance. Clouds may appear thin or scattered, hiding powerful vertical development inside. Pilots flying visually, especially in smaller aircraft, may misjudge what they are entering. Once inside such systems, conditions change quickly. Rain reduces visibility. Instruments become primary. Airspeed fluctuates. Orientation becomes more difficult. In these moments, the sky can feel less like a stable medium and more like an active participant. Radio communication adds another layer. Over oceanic regions, communication relies on different frequencies than over land. Signal quality varies. Atmospheric conditions can interfere. Messages may be delayed or distorted. For pilots accustomed to constant, clear contact, this introduces another source of uncertainty. When communication becomes intermittent, decision-making changes. Crews must rely more heavily on training and judgment. They may hesitate to divert without confirmation. They may push forward longer than ideal, trusting that conditions will improve. In some historical cases, radio transmissions from aircraft over this region sounded confused or disoriented. These recordings are often cited as evidence of something unusual, but when examined carefully, they reflect pilots under stress, dealing with rapidly changing conditions, limited visual references, and heavy workload. Stress affects speech. It shortens sentences. It disrupts clarity. It can make even experienced professionals sound uncertain. When such recordings are replayed later, stripped of context, they can feel ominous. Navigation in the air shares some vulnerabilities with navigation at sea. While aircraft are not affected by currents in the same way, wind plays a similar role. Strong crosswinds can push an aircraft off course. Headwinds slow progress. Tailwinds accelerate it. Accurate wind forecasting is essential, and errors accumulate over long distances. Before satellite navigation became universal, pilots relied on a combination of compass headings, time, airspeed, and wind estimates. Small miscalculations could place an aircraft far from its intended path. Over land, landmarks corrected these errors. Over water, there was nothing to check against. Magnetic variation again enters the picture. Aircraft compasses are subject to the same underlying magnetic field as ships. While aviation instruments are more sophisticated, they still require calibration and correction. In regions where magnetic variation changes, this must be accounted for. If it is not, headings drift. Waypoints are missed, corrections compound. The sky does not offer immediate feedback. A pilot may believe they are on course until fuel calculations begin to diverge from expectations. Fuel management is critical over oceanic routes. There are few diversion options. Misjudging consumption by even a small margin can become serious. Weather, turbulence, and altitude changes all affect burn rate. Several aircraft incidents associated with the Bermuda Triangle involved fuel exhaustion. Crews believed they had more fuel than they did. They trusted calculations based on assumptions that no longer held true. When engines failed, the cause was not mysterious, but the chain of decisions leading there was complex. The idea that the air feels wrong also relates to perception. Humans evolved to navigate in environments rich with sensory cues. The sky over open ocean strips many of these away. Without ground reference, the inner ear becomes unreliable. Spatial disorientation becomes a risk. This phenomenon is well known in aviation. Pilots can experience the sensation that they are climbing when they are level, or banking when they are straight. Without trusting instruments fully, these sensations can lead to dangerous control inputs. Training addresses this explicitly. Pilots are taught to ignore bodily sensations and rely on instruments. But training does not eliminate instinct. Under stress, the body asserts itself. The conflict between sensation and instrument can feel deeply unsettling. In regions where weather, turbulence, and visibility change rapidly, this conflict intensifies. The sky feels less predictable, less cooperative, slightly wrong, not because it is hostile, but because it demands constant vigilance. Another factor is air traffic density. The region is busy. Commercial flights, private aircraft, military operations, and recreational aviation all overlap. Managing traffic requires coordination across multiple control zones. Handovers occur frequently. Each handover introduces potential for miscommunication. Frequency changes, accents, static, timing. Small misunderstandings are usually resolved quickly, but under heavy workload they can persist longer than ideal. Modern systems have reduced these risks dramatically, but they have not erased them. Pilots still report moments where information feels incomplete or delayed. Over land, backup options abound. Over water, options are fewer. The psychological weight of this matters. Knowing that there is no immediate place to land changes how problems are experienced. A minor issue over land feels manageable. The same issue over open ocean feels heavier. This psychological pressure can alter perception. Sounds seem louder. Vibrations feel more pronounced. Instrument fluctuations feel more serious. The environment feels charged, even if objectively it is not. When pilots later describe these experiences, language reflects emotion as much as fact. The air felt strange. Conditions felt off. Something didn't feel right. These phrases are not technical, but they capture the lived experience of managing uncertainty in a demanding environment. Over time, such descriptions accumulate. They form a pattern of unease that becomes associated with place rather than circumstance. The Bermuda Triangle absorbs these stories because it already carries a reputation for difficulty. This does not mean pilots imagine problems that do not exist. It means their awareness sharpens, they notice more, they remember more vividly. Place becomes part of the story. In modern aviation, data recording has transformed investigation. Flight data recorders, cockpit voice recorders, radar tracking and satellite monitoring allow events to be reconstructed in detail. Many incidents once considered mysterious have been explained through this data, yet even with data, interpretation remains human. Investigators analyze sequences. They identify contributing factors. They see how small deviations align, and often, the conclusion is not a single cause but a cascade. Weather plus navigation error plus communication delay plus fatigue. Each factor alone insufficient. Together, decisive. The air above the Bermuda Triangle does not break rules. It follows them closely, sometimes too closely, amplifying their effects. Warm air rises, moisture condenses, wind shifts, magnetic fields vary. Human perception adapts imperfectly. The feeling that something is slightly wrong emerges when expectations meet complexity, when the environment does not behave as simply as hoped, when systems require more attention than usual. As aircraft technology continues to advance, this feeling becomes less common, but it does not vanish entirely. There are still moments when pilots encounter conditions that demand respect, when routines break, when attention sharpens. These moments remind us that flight, for all its sophistication, still depends on navigating invisible forces. Air cannot be seen, wind cannot be grasped, weather cannot be negotiated with. It can only be understood, anticipated, and responded to. The stories that grow from these encounters are shaped by memory and context. A pilot who has heard of the Bermuda Triangle may frame an unsettling flight differently than one who has not. This framing does not invalidate the experience, it shapes it. As we move forward, attention will turn toward the forces that drive much of this unpredictability, the weather itself, the systems that form, intensify, and move through this region with speed and power. Because the sky does not act alone. It is part of a larger pattern, one that connects air, sea, and the thin line of human decision-making stretched between them. Weather has a way of revealing how much control we only think we have. On land, its changes are usually framed by context. Clouds roll in over familiar streets. Wind rattles windows that have stood through countless storms. Rain falls on places that offer shelter almost immediately. At sea and in the air above it, weather behaves differently, not because it follows different rules, but because there is nothing to soften its transitions, no terrain to slow it, no structures to break it apart. Just open space, warm water, and moving air, all interacting at once. In the region often associated with the Bermuda Triangle, this interaction becomes especially intense. Not dramatic in the way stories sometimes suggest, but fast. Subtle at first, then decisive. Conditions can shift from manageable to challenging in a window of time small enough to catch even experienced crews off guard. The weather doesn't announce a change of intent, it simply evolves. One of the defining characteristics of this region is the warmth of the ocean. Warm water is energy. It feeds the atmosphere above it, loading the air with moisture and heat. When this warm, moist air rises and meets cooler air moving down from the north, instability forms. Instability is not chaos. It is potential, and potential can become reality very quickly. Storm systems here do not always arrive from afar. Some build almost in place. A scattered cluster of clouds becomes denser. Vertical growth accelerates. What looked like harmless cloud cover an hour ago becomes a towering system, capable of producing heavy rain, lightning, turbulence, and strong winds. For those moving through it, the transition can feel abrupt. Even if meteorologists understand the underlying process, this speed matters. Forecasts are built on models that estimate how systems will develop. Models are accurate within limits, but they cannot predict every local interaction. Over warm ocean water, small variations amplify. A slight temperature difference, a subtle shift in wind direction. These details can push a system to intensify faster than expected. For sailors, this means seas that change character quickly. Swells grow steeper. Wind direction shifts, turning manageable waves into breaking ones. Visibility drops as rain curtains move through. Decks that were safe minutes ago become hazardous. Decisions must be made quickly, often with incomplete information. For pilots, the challenges take a different form. Storm cells rise vertically, creating hazards at altitudes that were previously clear. Turbulence forms not only within storms, but around them. Air flows upward and downward in uneven patterns. A flight path that seemed clear becomes unstable. Weather radar helps, but radar has limitations. It shows precipitation, not all forms of turbulence. It provides snapshots, not certainty. Interpreting radar requires judgment, and judgment under time pressure is never perfect. The phrase "weather that changes its mind" captures how these shifts feel from inside the experience. It suggests intention, but what it really reflects is mismatch between expectation and reality. Crews plan based on what weather is likely to do. When it does something else, the plan must adapt. Historically, this adaptability was harder to achieve. Early forecasting relied on limited data. Observations came from ships and coastal stations, not satellites. Storms could develop beyond observation range and move quickly into shipping lanes. A ship might sail under clear skies in the morning and encounter severe weather by afternoon. Without warning, without time to reroute, without knowledge of how long conditions would last. Once committed, options narrowed. This unpredictability fed the region's reputation. Stories circulated of storms that appeared suddenly, of seas that rose too quickly, of winds that shifted without warning. These stories were grounded in real experiences, shaped by limited forecasting and communication. The Gulf Stream plays a quiet but significant role here. This powerful current carries warm water northward along the eastern edge of North America. Where it meets cooler waters, temperature contrasts sharpen. Air above these contrasts behaves differently. Storms can intensify as they draw energy from the warm current below. For sailors, the Gulf Stream also affects wave patterns. Wind blowing against current steepens waves, making seas more dangerous. A moderate storm can become far more hazardous when wind and current oppose each other. Ships may struggle to maintain heading. Progress slows, stress increases. For aircraft, the Gulf Stream influences wind at altitude. Jet streams interact with surface currents indirectly, shaping flight conditions. Strong winds aloft can change fuel calculations. Unexpected headwinds delay arrival. Tailwinds accelerate progress. Misjudging these factors affects planning. Weather systems here also interact with seasonal cycles. Hurricane season brings heightened risk. Tropical storms and hurricanes form over warm water and can intensify rapidly. While major storms attract closely, smaller systems still pose danger. Squalls can form ahead of larger systems, catching crews between forecasts. Squalls are particularly challenging. They are localized, intense bursts of wind and rain that develop quickly and dissipate just as fast. Radar may detect them late. Visual cues can be misleading. A squall line can turn calm conditions into near chaos within minutes. For sailors, squalls can knock down masts, shift cargo, and overwhelm inexperienced crews. For pilots, they introduce turbulence and wind shear, complicating control and approach planning. Wind shear deserves special attention. It occurs when wind speed or direction changes rapidly over a short distance. Aircraft encountering wind shear may lose or gain airspeed unexpectedly. At low altitude, this can be dangerous. Over oceanic routes where weather systems are less anchored, wind shear can appear unpredictably. The challenge is not just physical, it is cognitive. Rapidly changing weather demands constant reassessment. Plans must be revised, assumptions questioned. Under stress, this reassessment becomes harder. Humans prefer stability. We rely on patterns. Weather that changes quickly disrupts those patterns. It creates a sense of being chased rather than guided. This sensation feeds into the narratives that surround the region. It is important to note that none of this implies malicious behavior from the environment. The weather is not deciding anything. It is responding to physics. Heat moves, air rises, pressure balances. But from inside a ship or aircraft, the distinction between intention and process fades. What matters is impact. Modern forecasting has reduced uncertainty significantly. Satellites provide continuous monitoring. Models incorporate vast amounts of data. Warnings are issued earlier. Routes are adjusted proactively. Yet even now, weather surprises occur. Technology shortens reaction time, but it does not eliminate surprise. Systems still develop faster than expected. Local conditions still deviate from forecasts. The ocean and atmosphere remain complex. One reason weather changes feel more dramatic here is scale. Overland, terrain breaks up systems. Mountains disrupt airflow. Forests and cities alter temperature patterns. Over open ocean, systems grow uninterrupted. They expand horizontally and vertically without obstacles. This uninterrupted growth allows storms to organize efficiently. It also allows them to change structure quickly. A weak system can strengthen. A disorganized cluster can align. These transitions are subtle until they are not. For those navigating through, the line between caution and overconfidence matters. Trusting a forecast too rigidly can be as dangerous as ignoring it. Weather planning requires flexibility. When flexibility is constrained by fuel, schedule, or fatigue, risk increases. Fatigue again plays a role. Long hours at sea or in the air reduce cognitive resilience. Tired crews are slower to recognize developing threats. They may delay action, hoping conditions will stabilize. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they worsen. This delay is rarely dramatic. It is incremental. One more mile, one more hour, one more adjustment. By the time it is clear that conditions are deteriorating faster than expected, options are fewer. In maritime incidents, investigations often reveal that crews underestimated weather progression. They relied on outdated forecasts or misread signs. In aviation, similar patterns appear. Pilots continue toward planned routes despite increasing turbulence, believing it will ease. These decisions are not reckless. They are reasonable based on available information. The problem is that information becomes outdated quickly when systems evolve faster than models predict. Weather that changes quickly also affects rescue efforts. When an incident occurs, conditions may shift again before help arrives. Search patterns must adjust. Visibility changes. Debris disperses. What might have been recoverable becomes lost. This compounds the sense of mystery. A ship or aircraft encounters severe weather, fails and leaves little trace. By the time searches begin, the weather has moved on, erasing evidence. From the outside, this looks like disappearance. From inside the experience, it feels like being overtaken. The narratives that grow from these events often emphasize suddenness, storms appearing out of nowhere, conditions turning hostile without warning. While exaggerated, these descriptions reflect the subjective experience of rapid change. The human brain struggles with rapid transitions. We expect continuity. When continuity breaks, it feels wrong. That feeling becomes part of memory. In regions where such transitions happen more frequently, memory accumulates similar impressions. Over time, a reputation forms. The place becomes known for weather that cannot be trusted. This reputation feeds back into perception. Crews entering the region are more alert. They notice changes sooner. They attribute discomfort to location rather than circumstance. This does not create danger, but it colours interpretation. It is also worth noting that modern shipping and aviation schedules leave little room for delay. Economic pressure encourages efficiency, deviating from route costs time and money. This pressure can influence decision-making. When weather begins to change, the choice to divert is not purely technical. It involves cost, coordination, and communication. Delays ripple outward. This complexity can slow response. Weather does not negotiate with schedules. It does not wait for clearance. When it changes quickly, it forces decisions that reveal how systems prioritize risk. In the Bermuda Triangle region, these forced decisions have historically occurred often enough to leave a mark on collective memory. The weather here does not break rules, it applies them efficiently. As we continue forward, attention will turn to the water itself. The currents beneath the surface that pull without being seen. The forces that move ships even when sails and engines are steady. Because weather does not act alone. It works in concert with the ocean, and together they create conditions where small miscalculations carry long consequences. The sky may change its mind quickly, but it does so in response to deeper patterns. Patterns that are invisible until they are felt. Patterns that shape the stories we tell when something goes wrong, and the caution we carry when moving through places where change arrives without asking permission. The ocean rarely announces what it is doing beneath the surface. From above, it can look calm, even cooperative, a wide expanse of moving blue that seems to accept whatever crosses it. But below that surface, water is constantly on the move, flowing with purpose shaped by temperature, salinity, wind, and the slow rotation of the earth itself. These movements are not dramatic in the way storms are. They do not roar or flash. They pull, quietly, persistently, and often without being noticed until their effects have already accumulated. In the region commonly associated with the Bermuda Triangle, ocean currents play a central role in shaping what goes wrong and why it so often feels confusing afterward. This part of the Atlantic is not a still body of water. It is a crossroads of motion where powerful currents intersect, slide past one another, and sometimes tug in directions that challenge expectation. For sailors, these currents have always been among the most underestimated forces they encounter. The most famous of these currents is the Gulf Stream, a fast-moving river of warm water that flows northward from the Gulf of Mexico, along the eastern coast of the United States and out into the Atlantic. It is not a narrow stream, but a massive shifting flow that can be tens of miles wide and hundreds of meters deep. Within it, water moves far faster than the surrounding sea, sometimes exceeding speeds of 4 knots. For a ship moving at a modest pace, that difference matters. A current of just a few knots can quietly carry a vessel far off its intended course over the span of hours or days. Unlike wind, which is felt directly, currents work invisibly. The deck feels steady, the sails or engines perform as expected, and yet the ship's actual path across the earth drifts. Early sailors had no direct way to measure this movement. They could feel wind, they could observe waves, but the water beneath them offered no clear signal. Only when expected landmarks failed to appear did the truth become apparent. By then, the correction required might be significant. This disconnect between perception and reality is what makes currents so deceptive. They do not resist movement. They assist it, but not always in the direction intended. To the sailor steering a course, everything feels normal until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, there is rarely a single moment to point to and say, that's when it went wrong. The region's geography amplifies this effect. Warm tropical waters mix with cooler Atlantic currents. Eddies form, spinning off the main flow like detached thoughts. These rotating pockets of water can trap vessels temporarily, altering speed and direction unpredictably. Some eddies persist for weeks, others dissipate quickly. From the surface, they are often indistinguishable. Modern instruments can detect these features, but historically, sailors encountered them without warning. A ship might slow unexpectedly. Progress might feel uneven. Course adjustments that should have worked did not. The sensation was subtle, but over time it created unease. Currents also interact with weather in important ways. When wind blows against current, waves steepen. They become shorter, sharper, more difficult to navigate. What might be manageable seas under other conditions become hazardous. Ships take water over the bow, stability is compromised, fatigue increases. In the Bermuda Triangle region, this interaction occurs frequently. Storms moving across the Gulf Stream encounter warm water that feeds them additional energy. At the same time, wind patterns can oppose the current, creating chaotic surface conditions. The sea becomes confused, with waves arriving from multiple directions. This confusion makes navigation harder. It affects steering, it strains hulls, it complicates decisions, and because it can develop quickly, it catches crews off guard. One of the most frustrating aspects of current-driven incidents is how difficult they are to reconstruct afterward. Logs may record heading and speed accurately, yet the final position does not align with expectations. Investigators must account for unseen forces that varied over time and space. When wreckage is involved, currents scatter it. Debris fields stretch over wide areas. What might have been a single point of failure becomes a diffuse pattern. Finding the origin requires modelling water movement backward in time, a process filled with uncertainty. This scattering effect contributes to the sense of disappearance. A ship sinks, pieces float, currents pull them apart. By the time searches begin, debris may be far from the incident location. Searchers look in the wrong place, evidence is missed. For families and observers, this feels like erasure. The ocean does not preserve moments, it dissolves them. Another layer of complexity comes from depth. Much of this region drops sharply into deep water. When ships sink here, they descend quickly, often beyond reach. Unlike coastal wrecks that may break apart and wash ashore, deep water wrecks vanish into darkness. Currents at depth behave differently than surface currents. They can move in different directions. They can be slower, but they are persistent. Over time, they carry wreckage away from the sinking point. Even if a ship is eventually located, it may be far from where it was last reported. This separation fuels speculation. Last known positions feel inaccurate, timelines blur, the gap between expectation and outcome widens. For sailors experiencing strong currents firsthand, the psychological effect is significant. Steering becomes less responsive, progress feels unpredictable, effort does not yield proportional result. This erodes confidence. Confidence matters at sea. It affects decision-making. When sailors trust their control, they act decisively. When control feels compromised, hesitation creeps in. Hesitation in dynamic conditions can be costly. There are accounts of ships that struggled against currents until fuel or supplies ran low. Crews believed they were making headway when they were not. By the time the truth became undeniable, options were limited. In such situations, abandoning ship may seem rational, but lifeboats are even more vulnerable to currents. Small craft are easily overwhelmed. Survivors drift farther, faster, often beyond search areas. Currents do not care about intent. They do not negotiate. They pull without asking. This impartiality is difficult to accept emotionally. Humans prefer causes with agency. A storm can be blamed. A mechanical failure can be repaired. Currents simply are. They exist whether acknowledged or not. The Bermuda Triangle's reputation absorbs this frustration. The region becomes a symbol for forces that undermine control quietly rather than violently. The stories that emerge emphasize helplessness rather than struggle. It is also important to recognize that not all currents here are dangerous. The Gulf Stream, for example, has been used advantageously by sailors for centuries. When understood and anticipated, it shortens voyages. It carries ships efficiently. Knowledge transforms risk into resource. The problem arises when knowledge is incomplete or outdated. Currents shift over time. Climate patterns influence their behavior. What was reliable once may change subtly. Even today, captains plan routes carefully to account for currents. Pilots factor wind, which is the atmospheric counterpart. Small errors still occur, they always will. As technology improves, detection becomes better. Satellite altimetry reveals sea surface height variations associated with currents. Models simulate flow patterns, but models are approximations. They simplify complexity. The ocean resists simplification. It moves in layers, interacts with the atmosphere, responds to planetary forces. Predicting its behavior precisely is impossible. Understanding probabilities is the best available approach. This probabilistic nature does not sit comfortably with storytelling. Stories prefer clear cause and effect. Currents offer gradients and tendencies. They operate continuously, not discretely. When something goes wrong, it is tempting to attribute it to a moment, a decision, a failure. In reality, currents exert influence long before disaster strikes. They shape conditions quietly until thresholds are crossed. The sailors who first spoke of being pulled off course were not imagining things. They were describing a real phenomenon without the language to explain it fully. Their words reflected experience, not theory. Over time, these experiences were folded into a larger narrative. Currents became part of the mystery rather than part of the mechanism. Their invisibility made them seem suspicious. Yet invisibility is not intention. It is simply the nature of fluid dynamics. Water moves whether observed or not. As we continue this exploration, it becomes increasingly clear that the Bermuda Triangle is less about isolated anomalies and more about overlapping systems. Weather, magnetism, human perception, and now currents all interact. Currents that pull without asking do not create legends on their own. They require context. They require stories. They require moments when their quiet influence aligns with human error or environmental stress. Those moments leave marks, not on the water, but on memory. And memory, unlike the ocean, tends to hold on to patterns even when details blur. The pull continues whether noticed or not. Ships still cross these waters safely every day. The current flows beneath them, indifferent, persistent, shaping outcomes quietly. Understanding this does not remove risk, but it reframes it. What feels like mystery becomes complexity. What feels like disappearance becomes dispersion. What feels like intention becomes interaction. And yet, even with understanding, the sensation remains. That something beneath the surface is moving you in ways you did not choose. That progress is not entirely yours to command. That sensation, more than any myth, is what gives this region its lasting weight. Few ideas associated with the Bermuda Triangle have proven as persistent or as resilient to correction as the notion that magnetism behaves strangely there. The image is familiar: compasses spinning aimlessly, needles refusing to settle, navigation instruments betraying the very people who trust them most. It is an idea that feels technical enough to sound scientific, yet mysterious enough to invite speculation. And like many ideas that sit at that intersection, it has survived long after its simplest explanations became available. Magnetism, unlike storms or waves, is invisible. You cannot see it gathering, you cannot feel it directly, you only experience its effect through instruments. This invisibility makes it fertile ground for misunderstanding. When something unseen influences direction, and direction determines survival, it is easy to imagine intent where there is only physics. To understand where myth begins and reality holds firm, it helps to start with a basic truth. Earth is a magnetic planet. Its molten iron core generates a magnetic field that extends far into space. This field is not uniform. It varies by location. It drifts over time. It responds to solar activity. None of this is unusual. It is simply how a dynamic planet behaves. A compass does not point to the geographic North Pole. It points toward magnetic north, a moving target located hundreds of miles away from true north. The difference between these two directions is called magnetic declination, and it changes depending on where you are on the planet and when you measure it. This difference is not a flaw. It is a known characteristic of the system. In some places, magnetic north and true north align closely. In others, they diverge significantly. Navigators have always needed to account for this. Doing so requires updated charts and careful correction. When these corrections are missing or misunderstood, confusion follows. The region commonly labelled as the Bermuda Triangle has sometimes been described as a place where compasses point to true north rather than magnetic north. This is occasionally presented as something strange or disruptive. In reality, such regions exist elsewhere as well. They are called agonic lines, places where declination happens to be zero. These lines move over time as Earth's magnetic field shifts. An agonic line passing through a region does not break compasses. It does not confuse them. It simply means that in that location, the magnetic field aligns with geographic north at that moment. For a navigator unaware of this, it might appear that the compass has corrected itself or changed behaviour. For one expecting variation, it is unremarkable. The problem arises when expectation does not match reality. If a navigator expects declination and finds none, or expects none and finds some, trust in the instrument may falter. Doubt creeps in. Doubt leads to hesitation. Historically, this doubt mattered more than any magnetic anomaly itself. Early sailors lacked comprehensive magnetic maps. They relied on experience and partial knowledge. When compasses behaved differently than expected, they had no authoritative explanation to fall back on. This gap between experience and explanation is where myth takes root. Sailors did not need to believe in supernatural forces to feel unsettled. They only needed to encounter repeated inconsistencies without a framework to understand them. As navigation technology advanced, compasses became more refined, but they also became more sensitive. Iron ships introduced new challenges. Metal hulls and cargo created magnetic interference. This required additional correction known as deviation, separate from declination. Deviation varies by ship and changes with heading. Managing deviation requires calibration. If calibration is incomplete or outdated, compass readings become unreliable. This unreliability is not caused by the environment alone, but by the interaction between environment and vessel. In busy regions like the Atlantic shipping lanes, ships came from many ports, built to different standards, maintained with varying levels of care. A navigator moving from one vessel to another might encounter different magnetic behaviours. Without clear distinction between ship-induced deviation and Earth's magnetic field, confusion grew. When confusion clusters geographically, stories attach themselves to place rather than to equipment. The Bermuda Triangle absorbed these stories because it was already associated with difficulty. Magnetism became another layer in an existing narrative. In aviation, similar patterns emerged. Aircraft compasses are affected by magnetic fields and by the aircraft itself. Electrical systems, metal structures, and even cargo influence readings. Pilots are trained to cross-check instruments and account for known errors. Still, small discrepancies can occur. Before satellite navigation, pilots flying over open ocean relied heavily on magnetic headings. Over long distances, small errors accumulated. Windrift compounded the problem. If expected landmarks failed to appear, anxiety increased. When pilots reported navigation difficulties in this region, magnetism often became the assumed culprit. It was a plausible explanation, especially when combined with weather and limited visual references. Later retellings sometimes exaggerated these reports. A compass that required correction became one that spun uncontrollably. A slight heading discrepancy became total loss of direction. These embellishments made stories more memorable but less accurate. Scientific investigation into Earth's magnetic field has not revealed any region in the Bermuda Triangle where magnetism behaves in a way that defies known physics. Measurements show variation, but variation consistent with global patterns. There are no hidden magnetic vortices, no localized disruptions that would selectively affect navigation. What does exist is geomagnetic activity driven by the Sun. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections can disturb Earth's magnetic field temporarily. These disturbances can affect navigation systems, radio communication, and power grids worldwide. They are not confined to one region. During periods of strong solar activity, compasses can behave erratically. Radio signals degrade. GPS accuracy can drop. These effects are documented and monitored. Historically, they would have arrived without warning or explanation. If such an event coincided with a voyage through the Atlantic, its effects might be attributed to location rather than solar conditions. Again, context shapes interpretation. The human mind prefers localized causes. It feels more manageable to blame a place than a star 90 million miles away. Localizing the problem creates a sense of containment, even if it is illusory. Another factor often overlooked is record keeping. Many historical accounts of magnetic anomalies are second-hand. They were written after the fact, sometimes decades later. Details were lost or altered, memory substituted for measurement. When modern researchers examine original logs, many supposed anomalies disappear. The language is less dramatic, the observations more cautious, the conclusions tentative. Myth emerges in the space between primary record and popular retelling. This does not mean early navigators were wrong to be cautious. They were responding to genuine uncertainty. But uncertainty does not equal mystery in the supernatural sense. It equals incomplete information. As magnetic science advanced, declination maps improved. Navigators learned to correct systematically. Training emphasized cross-checking instruments rather than trusting any single reading. Confidence returned. Yet the stories did not fade. They persisted because they served a purpose beyond explanation. They expressed respect for forces beyond immediate control. They warned against complacency. They reminded crews to stay alert. In that sense, magnetic myths functioned as cautionary tales. They encoded practical advice into memorable narratives. Do not trust blindly. Verify. Expect variation. Pay attention. Even today, pilots and sailors are taught similar lessons, just framed differently. Technology has replaced superstition, but the underlying message remains. The problem arises when myth is mistaken for mechanism, when stories intended to encourage vigilance are interpreted as evidence of unique danger, when caution becomes fear. Measured reality paints a more nuanced picture. Earth's magnetic field is complex but predictable within bounds. Its variations are mapped. Its behavior is monitored. Navigational systems account for it. The Bermuda Triangle does not sit atop a magnetic anomaly that disrupts instruments selectively. It sits within a dynamic magnetic environment shared by the entire planet. What makes this region feel different is not magnetism alone, but the convergence of factors: busy traffic, rapid weather changes, strong currents, long distances without landmarks, human expectation layered on top. Magnetism becomes a convenient symbol for disorientation because it directly affects direction. Direction is psychological as much as physical. Losing it feels existential. When direction is questioned, everything else feels unstable. Time, position, safety. Stories of magnetic failure tap into this deep unease. It is also worth noting that modern navigation systems still include magnetic components. Pilots still learn magnetic headings. Ships still carry compasses. The system persists because it works when understood. Understanding removes fear, but it does not remove respect. The magnetic field will continue to change. Declination will continue to drift. Instruments will require calibration. Measured reality accepts this. Myth resists it. As we move forward, the focus shifts from forces we can measure to voices we can hear. Accounts from cockpits and decks. First-hand reports that capture experience rather than theory. Because even when science explains mechanisms, the human experience of uncertainty remains. The myths surrounding magnetism endure not because they are true in a literal sense, but because they articulate something real. The feeling of losing orientation, the discomfort of trusting something you cannot see, the quiet panic of realizing that certainty is thinner than you thought. Measured reality does not dismiss these feelings. It contextualizes them. It shows how complexity masquerades as mystery when knowledge lags behind experience. And in places where complexity concentrates, stories will always gather, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to separate fear from fact, without pretending that fear was never felt at all. When stories about the Bermuda Triangle are retold, they are often stripped of the people who lived them. Events become summaries. Incidents become bullet points. Outcomes replace experiences, but at the center of every disappearance, every near miss, every uneasy crossing, there were voices, pilots speaking into microphones, captains issuing orders across a deck, crew members responding, adjusting, listening. These voices, recorded or remembered, offer something far more revealing than any map or theory. They show what it felt like when things began to slip. In aviation, the cockpit is a place of controlled language. Pilots are trained to speak clearly, concisely, and without emotion, especially over radio. Words are chosen carefully. Tone is regulated. Even under stress, communication follows structure. This makes deviations noticeable. When a voice hesitates, when sentences shorten or repeat, when clarity softens into uncertainty, it stands out. Some of the most frequently cited accounts from the air involve radio transmissions that sounded confused or strained. Pilots reported difficulty maintaining headings. They questioned instrument readings. They asked for confirmation of position. To later listeners, these transmissions sound ominous, as if the speaker sensed something was fundamentally wrong. But when examined in context, they reflect a very human moment. A professional encountering conditions that no longer align cleanly with expectations, Flying over open ocean removes many of the cues pilots rely on subconsciously. There is no terrain to cross-check, no cities glowing beneath the clouds. At night, the horizon can vanish entirely, merging sky and sea into a single dark plane. Under these conditions, instrument reliance becomes total. Any disagreement between instruments becomes deeply unsettling. In recorded transmissions, pilots sometimes sound frustrated rather than afraid. They repeat information, they request clarification, they attempt to reconcile conflicting data. This is not panic, it is problem-solving under pressure. But problem-solving takes time, and time feels compressed when fuel, weather, and distance are all working against you. On ships, the dynamic is different but equally revealing. The bridge of a vessel is rarely silent. Orders are spoken aloud. Readbacks confirm understanding. Crew members respond with practiced rhythm. When something changes unexpectedly, that rhythm shifts. Voices overlap. Commands are repeated. The tempo increases. Accounts from surviving crew members often describe moments when routine broke. A sudden change in wind, an unexpected roll, a current that felt stronger than anticipated. These moments prompted verbal checks. Bearings were confirmed, speed was recalculated. When answers did not line up, tension entered the conversation. Unlike in aviation, where radio recordings sometimes survive, maritime voices are usually preserved through testimony. Survivors recall what was said, not always word for word, but in impression. They remember urgency, confusion, the sound of strain in familiar voices. These recollections are imperfect, but they are consistent in one way. They rarely describe a single catastrophic moment. Instead, they describe a gradual realization that something was no longer under control. The ship was not responding as expected. The weather was worsening faster than forecast. The current was stronger than calculations allowed for. In these moments, communication becomes both more important and more difficult. Stress narrows focus. People speak faster. They may assume shared understanding that is not actually present. Miscommunication creeps in, not through negligence, but through overload. Radio communication, whether between aircraft and control or ship and shore, adds complexity. Over oceanic regions, signals travel differently. Static interferes. Words drop out. Delays occur. Pilots and captains may believe they have conveyed information that was only partially received. In some famous accounts, final transmissions were incomplete. Sentences ended abruptly. Words trailed off. These fragments have been replayed countless times, analysed for hidden meaning, but often the simplest explanation is the most likely. Signal loss, interference, equipment failure, or a crew forced to prioritise action over communication. It's important to understand how radio discipline works in practice. In emergencies, crews are trained to communicate efficiently, but they are also trained to fly the aircraft or manage the ship first. If workload becomes overwhelming, communication is deprioritized. Silence does not mean confusion. It often means focus. This distinction is frequently lost in retellings. Silence becomes mystery, fragmentation becomes evidence of disorientation. But within professional context, these patterns are familiar. That said, not all accounts resolve neatly. There are instances where experienced crews reported sensations they struggled to articulate, a feeling that instruments were lagging, that responses were delayed, that timing felt off. These reports are rare, but they persist. Psychology offers insight here. Under sustained stress, perception changes. Reaction times feel slower. The world seems slightly delayed. This is not time distortion in a physical sense. It is cognitive load overwhelming processing capacity. When multiple tasks compete for attention, the brain prioritizes survival. Fine-grained temporal awareness diminishes. Afterward, memory reconstructs events unevenly. Gaps appear. Durations feel distorted. In interviews, pilots sometimes describe flights where everything technically worked, yet the experience felt wrong. They landed safely, but could not shake the sense that they had narrowly avoided something. These impressions are not evidence of hidden forces. They're evidence of how finely balanced modern navigation can be. On ships, similar impressions surface. Crews describe seas that felt heavier than expected, steering that required constant correction, progress that did not match effort. These experiences accumulate quietly until someone voices concern. Voicing concern is itself a critical moment. It marks the transition from routine to alert. It changes how information is interpreted. Once concern is spoken aloud, every subsequent observation is filtered through it. This is where narratives begin. Not after disaster, but during uncertainty. The words spoken in these moments shape memory. They anchor emotion to place. In the Bermuda Triangle region, these voiced concerns are often remembered more vividly because they align with existing reputation. A captain who says something feels off in these waters reinforces the idea that the waters themselves are responsible. In another region, the same words might be forgotten. This selective memory is not deliberate. It is human. We remember what fits. Another layer comes from training culture. Pilots and sailors are taught to respect certain regions. Not fear them, but approach them with heightened awareness. This awareness influences communication. Crews check in more frequently. They verbalize more. They question assumptions. Ironically, this increased communication can make a situation sound worse on record. More discussion implies more trouble, even if outcomes are routine. Cockpit voice recorders, where available, show this clearly. Flights that encounter turbulence or weather often feature increased verbal activity. Pilots narrate actions. They cross-check instruments aloud. This is good practice, but to an untrained ear it sounds tense. Maritime communication logs show similar patterns. Routine passages are sparsely recorded. Difficult ones are documented in detail. When historians later review these records, the ratio skews perception. Difficulty seems more common than it is. There are also cases where voices were never recorded, only inferred. A ship fails to arrive. Investigators reconstruct likely conversations based on procedure. These reconstructions sometimes become part of the story, mistaken for actual transcripts. Over time, imagined dialogue blends with real accounts. The line between what was said and what could have been said blurs. Despite this, first-hand voices remain invaluable. They reveal how people experienced uncertainty in real time. They show hesitation, adaptation, resilience. They remind us that navigation is not just mechanical, but deeply human. The voices from cockpits and decks do not describe portals or anomalies. They describe workload, conflicting data, rapid change. They describe professionals doing their best within constraints. What makes these voices unsettling is not what they say, but what they imply. That even with training and tools, control is conditional. That the margin between routine and crisis can be thin. As technology advanced, voices changed. Modern cockpits feature more automation. Communication includes system alerts. Data replaces intuition. But human voices remain the final link. Someone still interprets, someone still decides. And when something goes wrong, voices still carry it first, before wreckage, before reports, before theories. Listening to these voices carefully without imposing drama they did not intend reveals a consistent pattern. Uncertainty emerges gradually. It is noticed. It is discussed. It is managed, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The Bermuda Triangle does not silence voices. It records them unevenly. It preserves fragments. It amplifies those that end abruptly. As we continue forward, attention will turn to why some incidents end in disappearance while others resolve safely. Why certain sequences cross a threshold while others do not. The voices give us clues, not to hidden forces, but to decision points. Those decision points, shaped by environment and perception, are where outcomes diverge, and they are far more instructive than any myth if we are willing to listen without assuming the ending was inevitable. When people look back at the stories surrounding the Bermuda Triangle, one question surfaces again and again, sometimes quietly, sometimes with frustration. If the region is so dangerous, why do so many ships and aircraft pass through it without incident? And if the risks are known, why do some journeys end in disappearance while others, facing similar conditions, conclude safely? The difference between those outcomes is rarely dramatic and almost never mysterious in the way popular imagination prefers. It lives in details, timing, decisions, margins that were just wide enough in one case and just slightly too narrow in another. Disappearance is not a single event. It is a process. It begins with deviation, continues through escalation, and ends when recovery becomes impossible. Survival follows a similar path, but diverges at key moments. Understanding those moments is less about identifying a unique danger and more about recognizing how layered systems fail or hold together under stress. One of the most significant factors is timing. Weather does not strike uniformly. A ship that passes through a developing system hours earlier may encounter manageable conditions. Another arriving later may meet fully formed chaos. The difference between those experiences can be measured in minutes, not days. This timing sensitivity is especially pronounced in regions where systems intensify quickly. A squall line strengthens, a storm reorganizes, wind shifts direction. A crew that committed to a route based on an earlier forecast may find themselves facing conditions that no longer match expectations. Those who arrive later may divert in time. Those who arrive earlier may slip through unscathed. Fuel and endurance also matter. Aircraft operating near fuel margins have less flexibility. A diversion that is inconvenient for one flight may be impossible for another. Ships carrying limited supplies face similar constraints. When options narrow, risk increases. In many disappearance cases, investigations reveal that crews were operating closer to limits than realized. Fuel calculations assumed ideal conditions. Currents slowed progress. Weather forced altitude changes. Small inefficiencies accumulated. By the time the situation was recognized, reserves were gone. Survivors often tell a different story. They describe noticing changes early, questioning assumptions, diverting sooner than planned, accepting delays. These choices feel conservative in hindsight, but they require confidence and willingness to disrupt schedules. Human psychology plays a quiet role here. Commitment bias makes it difficult to abandon a plan once time and effort have been invested. The farther along a journey is, the harder it becomes to turn back. This bias affects pilots and sailors alike. In regions where weather and currents change quickly, this bias can be costly. A crew may continue forward hoping conditions will improve, even as signs suggest otherwise. Another crew, encountering similar signs, may choose to divert immediately. One outcome ends safely, the other may not. Experience matters, but not always in the way people expect. Highly experienced crews sometimes take greater risks because they trust their ability to manage adversity. Less experienced crews may be more cautious. Neither approach guarantees safety. It depends on context. Experience helps recognize patterns, but it can also normalize danger. A captain who has weathered many storms may underestimate the next one. A pilot who has flown through turbulence repeatedly may push farther than ideal. Experience informs judgment, but judgment is still human. Communication is another dividing line. Crews that communicate clearly and early often manage crises better. Those that delay reporting issues, whether due to pride, uncertainty or workload, lose support options. Silence isolates. In aviation, early communication allows controllers to offer reroutes, altitude changes and weather updates. In maritime operations, early distress signals mobilize rescue assets sooner. Time saved early can mean the difference between recovery and disappearance. Some incidents escalate too quickly for communication to make a difference. Structural failures, sudden flooding, explosive weather events. These cases are tragic but rare. More often there is a window where communication could help, but that window closes quietly. Search and rescue capability also shapes outcomes. In busy regions, response assets may be nearby. In others, help may be hours or days away. Even within the same region, availability varies by time of day, weather, and competing emergencies. A ship that fails near a shipping lane may be noticed quickly. Another failing farther away may drift unnoticed. Aircraft that disappear near radar coverage generate immediate response. Those beyond coverage may not. This uneven visibility affects which incidents are remembered. Successful rescues fade from memory. Disappearances linger. The narrative skews toward loss, not because loss is more common, but because it is unresolved. Survivability also depends on how systems fail. Gradual failures allow adaptation. Sudden failures overwhelm. A leaking hull gives time to respond. A catastrophic breach does not. An engine losing power gradually allows diversion. Sudden total failure may not. Environmental interaction compounds this. A ship taking on water in calm seas may stabilize. The same breach in heavy seas becomes fatal. An aircraft experiencing instrument issues in clear weather may manage. The same issues in storms escalate. These interactions are probabilistic, not deterministic. They do not guarantee outcomes. They influence likelihoods. Another critical factor is rescue window. Survival does not end when an incident occurs. It continues as long as people remain alive and reachable. Exposure, dehydration, injury, and fatigue all influence this window. In warm waters, survival time may be longer. In cold conditions, hypothermia sets in quickly. Currents disperse survivors. Lifeboats drift. Aircraft debris sinks. Rescue becomes a race against invisible clocks. When rescue arrives in time, stories end differently. Survivors recount fear, confusion, and relief. These stories often emphasize resilience rather than mystery. They are less likely to be retold as legends. When rescue does not arrive, absence becomes the story. Speculation fills gaps. The region itself absorbs blame. Technology has shifted these dynamics, but not erased them. Modern tracking improves visibility. Distress beacons alert rescuers automatically. Satellites monitor movement. Yet failures still occur. Technology introduces new dependencies. Systems that are trusted implicitly may fail unexpectedly. Over-reliance reduces redundancy. When backups are not prepared, recovery becomes harder. Training emphasizes redundancy for this reason. Cross-checks, backup instruments, multiple communication channels. When redundancy is respected, survival chances improve. When it is compromised, risk rises. One reason some disappearances persist in memory is that investigations conclude without certainty. Probable cause is established but not confirmed. Wreckage is not found. Data is incomplete. This uncertainty invites narrative. It is tempting to attribute this uncertainty to the place rather than the process. The Bermuda Triangle becomes a convenient container for unresolved cases. It offers a name for discomfort. But when cases are examined individually, patterns emerge. Weather underestimated, currents misjudged, communication delayed, fatigue present, decisions made under pressure. These patterns do not guarantee disappearance. They increase vulnerability. Whether vulnerability becomes loss depends on alignment, timing, severity, response. Survival stories often hinge on small interventions. A course correction made early, a distress call answered quickly, a passing ship nearby, a weather system weakening sooner than expected. These are not miracles, they are contingencies. Understanding this does not diminish tragedy. It contextualizes it. It shows that disappearance is not a property of a region, but an outcome of intersecting factors. This perspective also explains why the region remains active and safe for most traffic. The majority of voyages pass through without incident because conditions align favourably more often than not. Systems work, decisions hold. The danger lies in assuming that favourable alignment will continue indefinitely. It lies in underestimating variability. It lies in ignoring small signals. Stories of disappearance persist because they highlight failure. Stories of survival fade because they end. But both arise from the same environment. As we move forward, attention will turn to how science attempts to make sense of these patterns without myth, how data replaces narrative, how investigation reframes mystery as mechanism. Because the question is not why some disappear in this region. The question is why most do not. And the answer lies not in hidden forces, but in preparation, perception, and the fragile balance between expectation and reality that governs every journey through uncertain space. For a long time, the Bermuda Triangle lived mostly in the space between stories, not because science was absent, but because science arrived slowly, methodically, and without the dramatic flair that mystery thrives on. While headlines favoured vanishing ships and ominous speculation, researchers worked in quieter ways, collecting data point by point, instrument by instrument, trying to understand not whether something strange existed, but how ordinary forces interacted under particular conditions. Science rarely announces itself with certainty at first. It does not arrive to conquer mystery. It arrives to narrow it. And in the case of the Bermuda Triangle, that narrowing process took decades. The first step was simply measuring what was already happening. Oceanographers began deploying buoys to track currents, temperatures, and wave behaviour. Meteorologists expanded weather monitoring across the Atlantic, building better models of storm formation and movement. Aviation authorities gathered flight data, fuel usage patterns and navigation logs. Maritime organisations compiled incident reports, insurance claims, and recovery statistics. None of this work was aimed at disproving legends. It was aimed at understanding risk. One of the earliest revelations was statistical. When researchers compared the number of incidents in the so-called Bermuda Triangle to similarly trafficked regions of the world's oceans, the numbers did not support the idea of an unusually dangerous zone. Adjusted for traffic volume, the incident rate was comparable to other busy maritime corridors. This finding did not eliminate mystery in the public imagination, but it shifted scientific attention away from the idea of a unique anomaly and toward the mechanics of complex environments. The question became not what is different here, but how familiar factors combine here. Oceanographic studies revealed the depth and power of the Gulf Stream with unprecedented clarity. Satellite altimetry allowed scientists to see subtle changes in sea surface height that indicated current strength and direction. Drifting sensors tracked how water moved over time. These tools showed that currents in the region were not chaotic but dynamic and layered. They also showed how quickly those dynamics could change. Eddies formed and dissipated, boundaries shifted. Surface conditions did not always reflect what was happening below. For navigators relying on surface cues, this mattered. Meteorology followed a similar path. Improved satellite imagery allowed continuous observation of cloud development. Scientists could watch storms form from scattered convection, tracing how warm ocean water fed vertical growth. They could see how wind shear influenced storm structure. They could model how systems interacted with large-scale patterns like the jet stream. What emerged was not unpredictability, but sensitivity. Small changes in initial conditions produced larger downstream effects. This sensitivity explained why forecasts were sometimes wrong, without implying that weather was behaving irrationally. Aviation science contributed its own insights. Flight data recorders provided detailed records of aircraft performance. Investigators could reconstruct altitude, speed, heading, and system status second by second. When incidents occurred, Analysis often revealed cascading failures rather than single causes. In many cases associated with the region, investigators found that aircraft encountered unexpected headwinds or turbulence that altered fuel consumption. Navigation errors compounded. Crews adjusted altitude or speed to manage conditions, inadvertently increasing fuel burn. When fuel margins disappeared, options vanished. These findings were not sensational. They did not lend themselves to dramatic retellings, but they were consistent. Maritime investigations revealed similar patterns. Ships that sank or were abandoned often showed signs of structural stress exacerbated by weather and sea state. Cargo shifted. Stability was compromised. Pumps failed. Crews made decisions based on incomplete information. Importantly, science did not dismiss human experience. Researchers acknowledged that sailors and pilots felt disoriented, pressured, and uncertain. They recognized that perception under stress differs from observation under controlled conditions. Psychology became part of the analysis. Cognitive scientists studied how humans process information in high workload environments. They examined decision-making under uncertainty. They documented how fatigue, stress, and expectation influence perception. These studies helped explain reports of missing time and disorientation without invoking physical anomalies. Time perception changes under stress. Memory formation becomes uneven. People remember moments of high emotion vividly and lose track of quieter intervals. This does not mean people imagined their experiences. It means their experiences were filtered through a brain operating at the edge of capacity. Science also examined communication. Researchers analysed radio traffic patterns, noting how messages change during high workload phases. They studied how static, signal propagation, and frequency management affected clarity over oceanic distances. They found that many incomplete or confusing transmissions attributed to mystery were consistent with known communication limitations. Signal loss, interference, and prioritization of control over communication explained much of what had seemed ominous. Navigation science refined its models of magnetic variation. Detailed maps showed how declination changed across the Atlantic. These maps were updated regularly to account for drift. Training incorporated this information explicitly. As understanding improved, incidents related to magnetic confusion declined, not because magnetism changed, but because expectations aligned with reality. Science also benefited from hindsight. When wreckage was recovered years later using advanced sonar and submersible technology, investigators could confirm causes that had once been speculative. Structural failure, collision, storm damage. These recoveries did not attract the same attention as disappearances, but they quietly closed chapters. Search and rescue science evolved as well. Modelling of drift patterns improved. Rescuers learned how debris moved under different current and wind conditions. This allowed more accurate prediction of search areas. Even so, science acknowledged its limits. Models rely on assumptions. Data coverage is incomplete. Some wrecks remain undiscovered simply because the ocean is vast and deep. This humility is important. Science does not claim to explain every case definitively. It claims to explain patterns. One of the most significant shifts science introduced was a change in framing. Instead of asking why the Bermuda Triangle causes disappearances, researchers asked how disappearances occur anywhere. They compared environments. They identified risk factors. The region in question scored high on several of these factors: high traffic, variable weather, strong currents, deep water, long distances between safe havens. None of these are unique, but their overlap increases complexity. Complexity is not mystery, it is interaction. Science also highlighted survivorship bias. Most voyages succeed, they are not reported, they do not become stories. Failures are reported disproportionately. This skews perception. By examining comprehensive data sets rather than isolated incidents, scientists could see that the region was not statistically exceptional. It was narratively exceptional. This distinction matters. It explains why legends persist even as evidence accumulates. Narratives are not built on averages, they are built on extremes. Quiet scientific work does not replace stories, it reframes them. It shows that what feels inexplicable often becomes understandable when enough variables are considered. Yet science rarely satisfies emotional needs. It explains without comforting. It describes mechanisms without assigning meaning. For those seeking closure, this can feel incomplete. The Bermuda Triangle remains compelling because it sits at the boundary between explanation and experience. Science explains how things go wrong. It does not explain how it feels when they do. Researchers are aware of this gap. Increasingly, interdisciplinary studies attempt to bridge it. They combine physical data with human factors. They examine not just what happened, but how it was perceived. This approach respects both measurement and memory. It acknowledges that understanding risk requires understanding people. Quiet science also adapts. As climate patterns shift, conditions in the Atlantic change. Sea surface temperatures rise, storm behaviour evolves, currents respond, models update. What was true decades ago may change subtly. This does not resurrect mystery. It reinforces vigilance. Science does not declare the Bermuda Triangle solved and move on. It continues to monitor, measure and revise. It treats the region not as a riddle, but as a dynamic system. This ongoing work does not generate headlines. It generates charts. It generates training manuals. It generates improved procedures. Pilots receive better forecasts. Mariners receive updated current maps. Search and rescue teams use refined models. Incidents decline. Yet when something still goes wrong, the old narratives resurface. Because explanation does not eliminate risk. It only manages it. Science accepts this. It does not promise safety. It offers probability. As we move forward, the focus shifts to what remains unresolved. Not because science has failed, but because complexity never fully collapses into certainty. There are still cases where data is incomplete, where wreckage is not found, where final moments remain unknown. Science documents these gaps rather than filling them with speculation. These gaps are smaller than they once were, but they persist. Understanding that persistence requires stepping back from instruments and models and asking a different question. Not what forces act here, but why we continue to be drawn to places where certainty thins. Because even as science steps in quietly and carefully, it leaves room for reflection. And in that space, curiosity continues, not as fear, but as attention. Attention to how systems interact, attention to how decisions are made, attention to how humans navigate uncertainty. The Bermuda Triangle, viewed through this lens, becomes less a location and more a lesson. About preparation, about humility, about the limits of control. And those lessons do not conclude neatly. They carry forward, shaping how we think about risk, travel, and the stories we tell when something does not return. As we continue, that unfinished quality becomes the focus. What still does not add up, not because it defies explanation, but because explanation has edges where data fades and questions remain quietly open. For all the measurements taken, for all the charts refined and models improved, there remains a quiet space where certainty thins. Not a dramatic void, not a gaping hole in understanding, but a collection of small mismatches between expectation and outcome. These are the places where science pauses rather than declares victory, where investigators use words like likely, probable, and consistent with instead of definitive. And it is in these margins that the Bermuda Triangle continues to feel unfinished. What doesn't fully add up is rarely a single incident. It is the accumulation of cases where explanations fit most of the facts, but not all of them. Where timelines align broadly, but not precisely. Where data suggests a sequence, but cannot confirm the final moments. These gaps are not evidence of hidden forces. They are evidence of how difficult it is to reconstruct events in environments that erase their own traces. One of the most persistent challenges is incomplete data. Even in the modern era, tracking over open ocean has limits. Satellite coverage is extensive but not absolute. Radar has range constraints. Communication depends on systems that can fail under stress. When something goes wrong quickly, records can end abruptly. Flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders provide extraordinary insight when recovered. But recovery is not guaranteed. Deep water, rugged seabeds, and vast search areas make retrieval difficult. When recorders are not found, investigators must rely on indirect evidence. Indirect evidence is powerful but imperfect. It includes last known positions, fuel calculations, weather data, and radar tracks. From these, probable scenarios are constructed. But probability is not certainty. Multiple scenarios may fit the same evidence. In some cases, different investigative teams have proposed different explanations, each plausible. Mechanical failure versus fuel exhaustion, weather encounter versus navigation error, structural compromise versus human decision-making. None can be ruled out completely, none can be confirmed absolutely. This ambiguity is unsettling. Humans prefer closure. We want a clear cause, a clear lesson. Ambiguity resists that desire. Another area that remains difficult to resolve is timing. Not in the sense of missing time as something supernatural, but in the precise sequencing of events. When logs stop mid-entry, or transmissions end mid-sentence, the order of what happened next becomes speculative. Did a system fail first, triggering confusion, or did confusion lead to mismanagement that caused failure? Did weather escalate suddenly, or did gradual deterioration go unrecognized until it was too late? These distinctions matter, because they change how lessons are learned. Without complete timelines, investigations can identify contributing factors but struggle to rank them. Was fatigue central or secondary? Was weather decisive or merely aggravating? Did technology fail, or was it misused? Often the answer is some combination, but the weighting remains uncertain. Search and recovery limitations amplify this uncertainty. When wreckage is not found, hypotheses remain untested. Structural failures cannot be examined. Fire damage cannot be assessed. Impact angles cannot be measured. The physical evidence that would settle debates lies beyond reach. Deep ocean exploration has improved, but it is still selective. Only a fraction of the seafloor has been mapped in high resolution. Even known wreck sites can take decades to locate. Until they are found, absence remains. There are also cases where wreckage is found, but in unexpected locations, far from last known positions, scattered in ways that challenge initial assumptions. These findings often prompt revisions to earlier conclusions. Revisions are part of science. They are not failures, but they reinforce the sense that understanding is provisional. Another unresolved aspect involves human behavior under extreme stress. While psychology explains much about perception, memory, and decision-making, it does not predict individual responses perfectly. Two crews facing similar conditions may react differently. One crew may notice subtle changes early and act decisively. Another may normalize those changes, assuming they are manageable. These differences are shaped by experience, culture, fatigue, and momentary context. They are difficult to model. Investigations can identify decision points, but not always the internal reasoning behind them. Cockpit recordings help, but not all thoughts are spoken. Maritime operations often lack equivalent recordings entirely. This leaves space for interpretation. Investigators infer intent based on actions, but intent may not align with outcome. A decision that seemed reasonable at the time may appear flawed in hindsight. Hindsight itself is a complicating factor. Knowing the outcome changes how earlier actions are judged. Warning signs appear obvious after the fact. At the time, they may have blended into background noise. This gap between real-time perception and retrospective clarity contributes to the feeling that something doesn't add up. It feels as if crews missed what should have been obvious. In reality, They were navigating uncertainty with limited information. Another unresolved area involves rare coincidences. Low probability events do occur. Systems fail in unexpected combinations. Redundancies break down simultaneously. These events are statistically unlikely, but not impossible. When rare events cluster in a region over time, they draw attention. Patterns are perceived even if the underlying distribution is random. This does not mean patterns are illusory, but it complicates interpretation. Statistical analysis helps, but it too has limits. Data sets depend on reporting accuracy. Historical records are incomplete. Classification standards change. Comparing across centuries introduces noise. Science can say that the region is not uniquely dangerous on average. It cannot say that unusual sequences never occur. Averages smooth extremes. Extremes drive stories. There is also the matter of near misses. These rarely enter public awareness. Flights that divert successfully, ships that turn back in time, crews that manage crises quietly. These experiences shape professional knowledge but not popular narrative. Because near misses are not dramatic endings, they are underreported. Yet they contain valuable information about what almost went wrong. They reveal how close systems can come to failure without crossing the threshold. In the Bermuda Triangle region, professionals often speak privately about heightened awareness. Not fear, but respect. This respect is grounded in experience, not myth. It reflects understanding of variability. This professional caution contrasts with public fascination. The public seeks explanations that feel complete. Professionals accept that some uncertainty is unavoidable. Another unresolved dimension is changing environmental conditions. Climate patterns are shifting. Sea surface temperatures are rising. Storm behavior is evolving. Currents respond to these changes. Models update, but lag exists. Historical data may not fully represent current conditions. What was once rare may become more common. What was predictable may become less so. This introduces new uncertainty. Incidents that fit older explanations may require revision. Science adapts, but adaptation takes time. Technological dependence also evolves. Automation reduces workload, but introduces new failure modes. Systems interact in complex ways. When automation fails, manual intervention must be immediate and precise. Training addresses this, but practice cannot cover every scenario. Rare combinations of failures challenge even experienced crews. In such cases, post-incident analysis may identify what happened without fully explaining why certain choices were made. The gap between system design and human response remains. The Bermuda Triangle continues to attract attention because it sits at the intersection of these unresolved edges, not because it defies science, but because it highlights where science operates with probabilities rather than absolutes. It is also a reminder of scale. The ocean is vast, airspace is wide. Human activity occupies a thin layer between surface and sky. When something falls out of that layer, recovery is not guaranteed. This scale mismatch means that some questions will remain unanswered simply because evidence cannot be retrieved. This is not unique to this region, but the region's reputation amplifies the effect. There are also cultural layers that resist resolution. Stories passed down gain symbolic weight. The triangle becomes shorthand for uncertainty. It is invoked when explanations feel insufficient. This symbolic role persists even as specific claims are debunked. Because the symbol is not tied to facts alone, it is tied to feeling. The feeling that despite preparation, something can still go wrong. That despite technology, control is conditional. That despite explanation, experience retains its own authority. Science does not erase this feeling. It contextualizes it. It shows where knowledge ends and uncertainty begins. What still doesn't fully add up is not a hidden mechanism waiting to be discovered. It is the persistence of uncertainty itself, the refusal of complex systems to yield complete narratives. This refusal can be uncomfortable. It invites speculation. But it also invites humility. Accepting that some details will remain unknown does not diminish understanding. It clarifies its boundaries. The Bermuda Triangle remains a place where those boundaries are visible, where explanation and experience meet without fully merging. As we move forward, the question shifts again, not toward what is missing, but toward why the triangle continues to hold attention long after its most dramatic claims have been addressed. Because unresolved details alone do not sustain fascination. Meaning does, and meaning is shaped not only by what we know, but by what we cannot quite finish explaining, even when we know enough to move on. Even after explanations accumulate, even after charts fill in blank spaces and investigations close most of the open files, the Bermuda Triangle continues to occupy a distinct place in our collective attention. This persistence is not accidental, and it is not simply the result of outdated myths clinging to life. The triangle remains compelling because it sits at a crossroads of human psychology, cultural memory, and the limits of certainty. It offers something that pure explanation does not easily replace. At its core, the triangle represents a challenge to expectation. Modern life is built on the assumption that systems work, that technology reduces risk, that knowledge accumulates in a way that steadily pushes uncertainty outward. We're accustomed to believing that if something goes wrong, there will be a clear reason, a report, a correction. The Bermuda Triangle resists that rhythm. It reminds us that even well-understood systems can fail in ways that feel unsatisfying. This discomfort matters. Humans are not neutral processors of information. We are meaning-making creatures. We look for narrative structure, for causes that align with effects, for endings that close the loop. When those elements are missing, attention lingers. The triangle offers unresolved endings, not because nothing is known, but because not everything can be known. That distinction is subtle, but powerful. It allows curiosity to persist without requiring belief in anything extraordinary. You do not need to accept supernatural explanations to feel unsettled by unanswered questions. There is also the role of place itself. Humans attach meaning to geography. Certain locations become symbolic through repetition. Battlefields, mountains, crossroads. The Bermuda Triangle has become one of those symbolic places, not through a single defining event, but through accumulation. Each story layered onto the region reinforces its identity. Even when individual stories are explained, the identity remains. It is reinforced by familiarity. People recognize the name. They know what it implies. This recognition creates a feedback loop. New incidents, even unrelated ones, are more likely to be associated with the triangle simply because the association already exists. Media plays a role here, but it is not the sole driver. The triangle's hold predates modern sensationalism. It emerged during a time when travel itself was more precarious, when long-distance journeys were rare enough to feel significant. Early losses carried emotional weight. That weight has not dissipated entirely, even as travel has become routine. There is also an important asymmetry in how we remember success versus failure. Millions of safe crossings fade into anonymity. They leave no story. A single disappearance, by contrast, creates ripples. It demands attention. It invites retelling. This asymmetry shapes perception. We do not naturally think in terms of probabilities. We think in terms of examples. One vivid example outweighs countless uneventful cases. The triangle benefits from this cognitive bias. It's remembered through exceptions rather than norms. Another reason the triangle holds attention is that it involves ordinary people doing ordinary things. These are not explorers seeking danger. They are pilots on routine flights, sailors following established routes, passengers expecting arrival. When something goes wrong in such contexts, it feels closer to home. Contrast this with extreme environments. We accept danger in polar expeditions or deep-sea exploration because risk is explicit. In the Bermuda Triangle, risk is implicit. It hides behind normalcy. That makes failures feel more disturbing. There is also a temporal element. The triangle's stories span decades. They are not confined to a single era. This continuity creates the impression of persistence. Even if incidents are less frequent now, the historical record remains active in memory. Continuity suggests pattern. Pattern invites interpretation. Interpretation sustains interest. Psychologically, the triangle sits at the intersection of control and vulnerability. Modern culture emphasizes control. We schedule, predict, optimize. The triangle represents moments when control slips despite preparation. This slip is not dramatic. It is incremental. A forecast slightly off, a current slightly stronger, a calculation slightly optimistic. These small deviations align in ways that undermine confidence. The result is not chaos, but fragility. Fragility is uncomfortable because it challenges assumptions. It suggests that safety is conditional rather than guaranteed. The triangle embodies this suggestion. There is also an aesthetic component. The open ocean is visually simple and cognitively complex. It offers few cues, few landmarks, few anchors for attention. This simplicity amplifies uncertainty. When something disappears into the ocean, it feels final in a way that land-based incidents do not. The sea does not preserve evidence readily. It absorbs, it scatters, it hides. This characteristic shapes narrative. Absence becomes more prominent than presence. In the triangle region, this effect is magnified by depth. Wrecks fall into places that are difficult to reach. They remain unseen for long periods, sometimes indefinitely. This physical inaccessibility reinforces the sense that answers are withheld. The triangle also persists because it adapts. As older explanations are challenged, new angles emerge. Psychology replaces magnetism. Human factors replace mystery. The story evolves rather than collapses. This adaptability keeps the topic alive. It allows engagement without requiring belief in disproven ideas. One can discuss the triangle in terms of risk analysis, decision-making, and system interaction. These discussions remain relevant. Education has also played a role. The triangle is often introduced early as a curiosity. It becomes part of cultural literacy. People encounter it before they encounter the tools to fully contextualize it. First impressions matter. They linger. Later explanations must contend with these early impressions. Even when rational understanding improves, the emotional imprint remains. The triangle continues to feel significant. There is also the matter of scale again. The triangle is large. Its boundaries are vague. This vagueness allows inclusion. It is easier to project onto a space that is not tightly defined. Precise boundaries limit imagination. Ambiguous ones invite it. Ambiguity is not a flaw here. It is a feature. It allows the triangle to function as a container for uncertainty more broadly. It becomes a stand-in for the idea that not everything is neatly categorized. In this sense, the triangle is less about geography and more about epistemology. It is about how we know what we know and what we do when knowledge feels incomplete. This makes it resilient. Debunking specific claims does not remove the underlying tension. That tension is between expectation and reality, between planning and outcome. The triangle also intersects with trust. Trust in instruments, trust in forecasts, trust in expertise. When incidents occur despite expertise, trust is tested. This testing is not unique to this region, but the region's reputation amplifies it. Failures elsewhere are isolated. Failures here feel thematic. That thematic quality sustains attention. It encourages people to ask not just what happened, but what it means. Meaning making is central here. The triangle is often framed as a lesson, a warning, a reminder. Even when stripped of myth, it still functions as a symbol of humility. Humility is not always comfortable. It asks us to accept limits. It asks us to acknowledge that explanation does not equal control. The triangle invites this acknowledgement quietly, persistently. There is also the role of storytelling tradition. Stories about the triangle are often told in calm voices, at night, framed as reflection rather than alarm. This mode of telling reinforces contemplation rather than fear. Such storytelling does not demand belief. It invites attention. It allows the listener to sit with uncertainty without resolving it immediately. This is rare in modern information culture, which favours resolution. The triangle resists resolution. That resistance is part of its appeal. Another factor is repetition across generations. Each generation encounters the triangle anew, with new tools, new perspectives, new language. But the core questions remain similar. Why do things go wrong here sometimes? Why do explanations feel incomplete? Why does this place feel different even when it is statistically ordinary? These questions are not answered once. They are revisited. Revisiting does not require novelty. It requires relevance. The triangle remains relevant because the conditions it highlights persist. Complex systems, human decision-making, environmental variability. These are not historical curiosities. They are ongoing challenges. In aviation and maritime training, the triangle is sometimes referenced indirectly, not as a danger zone, but as an example of why complacency is risky, why redundancy matters, why situational awareness cannot lapse. This practical relevance reinforces cultural presence. The triangle becomes shorthand within professional contexts, even if stripped of myth. There is also a social dimension. The triangle is often discussed conversationally. It serves as a shared reference point. People know what is meant without explanation. This shared understanding keeps it alive. Shared references are powerful. They create connection. They facilitate discussion. The triangle functions as one of these references. Importantly, the triangle's hold is not about fear. Most people do not avoid travelling through the region. They do not expect danger. The fascination is quieter. It is reflective rather than alarmist. It is about acknowledging that even in a world of systems and safeguards, unpredictability remains. That some outcomes resist tidy explanation. This acknowledgement does not undermine progress. It contextualizes it. The triangle also allows engagement with uncertainty at a safe distance. One can think about risk and loss without being personally threatened. This distance makes contemplation easier. At the same time, the stories involve real people. This keeps the discussion grounded. It prevents abstraction from becoming detached. The balance between distance and relevance is delicate. The triangle maintains it well. Another reason it persists is that it is unresolved without being insoluble. There is no single answer waiting to be discovered that will close the book. The triangle is not a puzzle with a hidden solution. It is a case study in complexity. Complexity does not end. It evolves. As understanding deepens, new questions arise. As systems improve, new failure modes appear. The triangle reflects this dynamic. In this way, it mirrors broader human experience. We solve problems and create new ones. We reduce risk and reveal new vulnerabilities. The triangle becomes a microcosm of that process. This mirroring creates resonance. People recognize the pattern even if they do not articulate it explicitly. The triangle also benefits from being geographically distant for many. It is real, but remote. This remoteness allows imagination to operate freely. Places closer to home are constrained by familiarity. Distance enhances mystery. Yet the triangle is not too distant. It is not on another planet. It sits within reach of everyday travel routes. This balance keeps it grounded. Finally, the triangle holds attention because it does not demand a stance. One does not have to believe or disbelieve. One can simply observe. This openness is rare. Many topics polarize. The triangle invites contemplation without allegiance. It allows people to say, something about this still feels unfinished, without needing to define what that something is. That feeling is enough. As we continue, the focus will shift once more. away from fascination itself and toward what remains when fascination softens, toward how the triangle fits into a broader understanding of uncertainty and rest, not as a warning, not as a riddle, but as a quiet companion to the idea that some questions are meant to remain open, not because answers are forbidden, but because openness itself has value, and in that openness the triangle continues, not insisting, not threatening, simply remaining present in the background of how we think about places where certainty thins and attention naturally lingers. Leaving the Bermuda Triangle does not feel like crossing a boundary. There is no visible line where tension dissolves or certainty returns all at once. The ocean looks the same. The sky behaves as it always has. Instruments continue to function. Currents continue to move. Weather continues to form and dissolve. And yet, for many who have passed through this region with awareness of its history, there is a subtle shift in attention as distance grows. Not relief exactly, but a loosening. A sense that something complicated has been left behind, even if it was never fully grasped. Drifting out of the triangle is less about geography and more about mindset. It is the moment when accumulated questions begin to quiet, not because they are answered, but because they no longer demand immediate resolution. The journey continues, and with it, the understanding that uncertainty did not begin in this place, and does not end here either. What lingers is not fear, but curiosity, not the dramatic kind fueled by mystery, but a quieter curiosity rooted in recognition. Recognition that complex systems do not yield clean narratives. Recognition that human experience often outpaces explanation. Recognition that even when science provides frameworks, lived moments retain texture that cannot be reduced to charts or models. This lingering curiosity is part of why the triangle remains present even after one has mentally moved on. It becomes a reference point, a reminder of how easily confidence can be challenged without being shattered. It teaches not distrust, but attentiveness. Those who cross these waters today do so with tools unimaginable to early sailors and pilots. Satellites track position continuously. Weather systems are monitored globally. Communication is instant, redundant, layered. And still, training emphasizes humility. Check assumptions. Verify instruments. Expect variability. The lessons encoded in centuries of experience have not been discarded. They have been refined. Drifting away from the triangle does not mean discarding its lessons. It means carrying them quietly into other contexts, other routes, other decisions, other moments where systems appear stable until they are not. The triangle in this sense is not unique. It is representative. It stands in for any environment where overlapping forces reduce margins and amplify consequences. Mountains in shifting weather, polar seas, crowded airspace, complex industrial systems. The triangle feels special because it gathered stories early, before language and science could fully articulate what was happening. Those stories shaped perception, and perception shaped memory. Memory in turn shaped narrative. Over time, the narrative gained weight beyond its factual core, but the core itself remained relevant. When people say they are drifting out of the triangle still wondering, they are not wondering about monsters or portals. They are wondering about how often outcomes hinge on timing rather than intent, about how preparation interacts with chance, about how responsibility is shared between decision makers and environments. This kind of wondering does not seek resolution. It seeks orientation. It helps place human agency within larger systems. There is also an emotional dimension to this drifting away. Disappearances carry grief. Unanswered questions linger for families and communities. No amount of explanation fully resolves that. Science can outline likely sequences, but it cannot restore what was lost. That absence remains. Acknowledging this absence without filling it with speculation is difficult. It requires sitting with incompleteness. The triangle invites this practice whether we intend it to or not. For those who have never crossed the region physically, the drifting is conceptual. It happens after reading accounts, hearing stories, absorbing explanations. There comes a moment when fascination softens, when the urge to explain gives way to acceptance that explanation has edges. Those edges are not failures. They are boundaries between knowledge and experience, between what can be measured and what can be remembered, between system behaviour and human response. The triangle marks those boundaries clearly because it has been examined so thoroughly. It has been mapped, modelled, debated, and revisited. And yet it still feels slightly unfinished. That unfinished quality is not an invitation to mystery, but to restraint. Restraint in assuming certainty. Restraint in dismissing experience. Restraint in turning complex interactions into simple causes. This restraint is valuable beyond the triangle. It applies to how we interpret accidents, failures, and near misses everywhere. It reminds us that outcomes are rarely the result of a single factor. They emerge from alignment. Alignment is unpredictable. It depends on conditions that shift continuously. When alignment favours stability, journeys pass unnoticed. When alignment favours failure, consequences follow. The triangle stories highlight this alignment more vividly than most places, not because it produces more failures, but because it produced early attention. That attention amplified certain cases, creating a feedback loop that persists. As attention moves elsewhere, the triangle does not vanish. It settles into background awareness. It becomes one reference among many for thinking about uncertainty. This settling is what drifting out feels like. Not leaving behind, but integrating. Integration allows the triangle to exist without urgency, without the need to prove or disprove, without insisting on meaning. It also allows space for appreciation of the ordinary success that surrounds it, the thousands of flights and voyages that pass through safely, the systems that work as intended, the decisions made quietly and correctly. These successes do not erase the stories of loss, they contextualize them. They show that risk is not destiny, that preparation matters, that vigilance reduces vulnerability. At the same time, they remind us that reduction is not elimination. Residual risk remains. It always will. Drifting away from the triangle does not mean forgetting this. It means holding it lightly. There is a temptation to conclude with reassurance, to say that everything is understood now, that the triangle no longer holds any secrets. Such conclusions feel tidy, but they do not reflect reality. Reality is not tidy. It is layered. It resists final statements. Instead, the more accurate response is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that much has been learned. Acknowledgement that some details remain unknowable. Acknowledgement that this combination is normal. The triangle teaches this without instruction. It does not announce its lesson. It accumulates it slowly, through repetition and reconsideration. As attention drifts outward, the questions that remain are quieter. They do not ask what the triangle hides. They ask how humans respond when certainty thins. Do we rush to fill gaps with stories, or do we allow gaps to exist? Do we mistake explanation for control, or do we recognize control as conditional? Do we listen to experience even when it complicates theory? These questions do not belong to the triangle alone. They belong to any domain where systems exceed individual comprehension. The ocean, in this sense, is a useful teacher. It does not negotiate. It does not adapt to expectation. It operates according to forces that predate and outlast human presence. Engaging with such an environment requires humility. The triangle's history reinforces this requirement. Humility does not mean fear. It means awareness of limits. As we drift further away, the triangle becomes less a place and more a perspective, a way of holding complexity without demanding closure. This perspective is valuable in a world increasingly reliant on systems that function invisibly. Power grids, communication networks, transportation infrastructures, financial systems, all complex, all interconnected, all susceptible to cascading failure. The triangle's stories echo in these domains, not literally but structurally. They remind us that complexity amplifies consequences and that small deviations can matter. Carrying this awareness does not paralyze action, it informs it. Those who work in high-reliability fields often speak of staying curious, of treating systems as dynamic rather than static, of resisting complacency. These principles align closely with the triangle's quieter lessons. The fascination fades when these lessons are internalized. The triangle no longer needs to be extraordinary. It becomes instructive. And yet, even as instruction replaces fascination, wonder remains. Wonder not mystery but at scale, at the vastness of the ocean, at the delicacy of navigation, at the precision required to move safely through environments that do not care whether you succeed. This wonder is not loud. It does not demand attention. It sits in the background, like the horizon itself. The horizon never closes. No matter how far you travel, it remains just ahead. The triangle occupies a similar position in thought. It recedes without disappearing. Drifting out, still wondering, is not a failure to conclude. It is an acknowledgement that not all journeys are meant to end with answers neatly packed away. Some journeys change how you think rather than what you know. The Bermuda Triangle has done that for generations, not by defying explanation, but by revealing the edges of it. As attention moves on, those edges remain visible. They inform caution, they invite patience, they temper certainty. And somewhere beyond them, the ocean continues, indifferent, expansive, offering passage without commentary. The sky above does the same. Journeys continue, most arrive, some do not. Understanding improves, uncertainty persists. Drifting out of the triangle does not resolve this balance, it accepts it. And in that acceptance, the wondering does not disappear. It softens. It becomes part of how we move forward, carrying with us the quiet knowledge that even well-travelled paths can hold moments where attention deepens, assumptions loosen, and understanding grows not by closing questions, but by learning how to live alongside them.